Vincent was a well-known hunter in the area with years of experience, a muscular build, and sharp senses. He also had a beautiful wife named Alina. Unfortunately, the couple had trouble conceiving and couldn't have children. A few years ago, on a quiet night, Vincent kept hearing soft cries coming from the stable. At first, he thought it was some wild animal, but when he grabbed his axe and went to check, he was stunned to find a small child, fair-skinned with blonde hair, wrapped in a blanket and lying in the middle of the stable. Years passed, and the child grew up. He had blonde hair and blue eyes and was incredibly beautiful and charming. The boy was named Aryan Shirone, and he was the main character of our story. Vincent and Evelina always treated him as their own beloved son. Every day, Vincent would take him into the woods, and while Vincent chopped wood, Shirone would immerse himself in the magical books his father had bought for him. Their family was warm and loving, but the village children didn't seem to like Shirone very much. The reason was quite childish. He was always reading books, and on top of that, he was very skinny and looked delicate, almost like a girl. He didn't have the strong, muscular build that Vincent did. There were many rumors going around the village that Shirone had been picked up by Vincent and his wife from some dark corner of the world. Naturally, the village kids knew about it too. While it was true that Shirone was an adopted child, Vincent couldn't stand the gossip about the little one he treasured like a gem. Vincent always felt like it was his fault that Shirone was pushed away by the other children. Of course, he couldn't just go around slapping every one of them. So to make up for his guilt, he took his son on frequent trips, hoping to broaden his horizons. The next morning, Vincent took Shirone to the city of Creeds on the outskirts of the kingdom of Thormia. It was Shirone's first time in the city, and the hustle and bustle of the place left him wide-eyed and amazed by the grand sights. Vincent still had a few things to take care of, so he stopped the carriage in front of a fruit shop owned by an acquaintance. He looked at his son and said, "Stay here until I get back." Though Shirone was usually well-behaved, this was his first time in the city, so Vincent couldn't help but remind him over and over not to wander into shady alleys or run into any nobles before he finally drove off. Shirone stayed by the fruit stand trying to prove his usefulness by offering to write a sign for the elderly man. The old man seemed surprised that a country boy like him could read and write, and he even thought Shirone was quite bright and sharp. As he was lost in admiration for the beautiful child, Shirone suddenly asked, "Excuse me, do you know magic?" "What? Magic law?" "No magic." Shirone replied eagerly, holding up the large magic book that Vincent had bought for him. The man laughed. "Ah, kids will always be kids. They all love that kind of stuff. Dragons, heroes, wizards." But seeing the sparkle of hope in Shirone's eyes, he couldn't bear to disappoint him. So he pointed toward the alley ahead. "I don't know much about magic, but there are plenty of books about it over there." Shirone followed the direction of his finger, and his eyes lit up when he saw a large bookstore at the end of the alley. With the man's approval, he immediately ran toward it. However, once inside the bookstore, Shirone was stopped by the arrogant shopkeeper. She wouldn't let him touch any of the books on the shelves, saying they were too expensive for poor people like him. Just then, the shop welcomed a distinguished guest. The shopkeeper called him the head butler, though it wasn't clear which noble family he served. While the shopkeeper was busy talking to the man, Shirone quickly flipped through a few books on the shelf, only to realize there was nothing particularly interesting in them. Feeling bored, he walked out of the store and happened to see a man carrying a box of books walking by. Shirone, who loved books, couldn't resist and ran after him. What shocked him next was that the man simply dumped the box of books into a trash pile. "So this is where Dad gets books for me?" Shirone thought to himself. He stood there in stunned silence for a few seconds, then approached the trash and carefully picked up each book to take a look. As he did, he heard some laughter and conversation nearby. He turned around and saw two noblewomen happily chatting, each holding a book. Shirone couldn't help but wonder, what was the difference between him and these people? Why had his father told him not to get involved with the nobility when he left? And why were they allowed to read whatever books they wanted while he couldn't? As these thoughts raced through his mind, Shirone instinctively began following the two women, but before he could catch up, a tall, imposing soldier stopped him. "Hey kid, this isn't the place for someone like you to be hanging around. Beyond this gate is the area for the nobles. Where are you from? Where are your parents?" "Oh, my dad is nearby," Shirone replied nervously. At that moment, another soldier approached. He took one look at Shirone and immediately felt something was off. Shirone didn't look like the other kids around here. They quickly assumed he was either an orphan or maybe even an accomplice of thieves, so they decided to drag him in for questioning. But Shirone was quick. He yanked off his outer jacket and managed to escape. He hid behind a few bushes, his hair a mess and his clothes dirty. Despite all that, he felt lucky to have gotten away without being caught. Just as he was about to pick up his shoes and head back to the fruit vendor, he heard voices coming from behind the tall stone wall. "Now let's discuss what magic really is, shall we?" "No, headmaster. Please show us how you breathe fire. A few voices responded eagerly. Shirone looked up at the wall twice or three times his height, and of course, couldn't see a thing. Wait, could this be a magic academy? Excitement bubbled up inside him. Shirone pressed his ear to the wall, straining to listen. Inside, the person they called the headmaster continued asking questions to his students. He asked them what the most important thing to learn about magic was. Some said knowledge, others said hard work, and some even argued that money was the key, but no one had given the right answer yet. Shirone made an effort to listen carefully, and eventually, he got the answer from the principal. The most important thing when studying magic is clarity of mind. The noble-born students in here are all around your age. When I mentioned clarity of mind, they all looked confused. What does that mean? The principal didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked a question. Is there anyone here who doesn't know what 1 plus 1 equals? Who doesn't know that? It's 2, of course, the students all shouted. Then, can anyone explain why 1 plus 1 equals 2? The principal asked again. The students exchanged glances, but no one could answer. The strange feeling they had at that moment, that was clarity of mind. There was a time when people didn't know that 1 plus 1 equals 2, and many scholars worked hard just to prove it. But even without concrete proof, we still understand that 1 plus 1 equals 2, don't we? That's because it's a rule that has always existed in the world. That's why we don't need to study it. We've already instinctively understood and accepted it. Magic is the same. From the very beginning, it has been present in this world. We can feel it and accept it with our own clarity of mind. That's why it's more important than knowledge or hard work, the principal explained all at once. The kids at the academy were still trying to process everything he had just said. But Shirone, who was eavesdropping outside, felt his heart pounding loudly. The most important thing when learning magic wasn't money, nor noble status. It was wisdom. Does that mean even a kid like me could become a great sorcerer? Shirone thought, both excited and nervous, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest when he heard the principal's voice call out, "Child behind the wall, I want to hear your thoughts." Shirone jumped in surprise. He hadn't imagined that a thick wall like this could still give him away. Should he run or try to answer the question, especially in his filthy, scruffy state? Shirone feared that the principal, along with the other children inside, might look down on him, just like the bookstore owner or those 2 guards had, disgusted by how poor and dirty he was. But he also feared that if he let this opportunity slip away, he'd regret it for the rest of his life. So with some kind of overwhelming drive, Shirone pushed himself to climb the wall step by step, his small body struggling but determined. He looked a mess, but his eyes were shining brightly. Shirone saw the headmaster of the Magic Academy sitting under a tree with a few children. The headmaster looked very kind and gentle, nothing like the bookstore owner or the guards. As soon as he saw Shirone, he spoke first. "Hello there, are you here to play with me?" The headmaster, Mary Alpheus, was a level 4 mage and the founder of the Alpheus Magic Academy. Shirone gathered all his strength to jump down from the wall and then slowly walked over. The children sitting around Alpheus were all from noble families, their clothes neat and spotless, a sharp contrast to Shirone's appearance. Some of them immediately recognized him as a commoner and without hesitation tried to shoo him away, but Headmaster Alpheus wasn't like that. "It's all right, come on over," he said kindly. What was it about this old man's words that caught Shirone's attention? The headmaster's gentle demeanor made Shirone feel much more confident. Although he was usually shy, he managed to speak up and ask for something he truly wanted. "I want to see magic. I've only ever read about it in books, but I've never seen it with my own eyes." Before Alpheus could respond, the children around him began to chatter. They called Shirone a liar, questioning how a commoner could possibly read books. "You know I have no voice here, so I bowed my head low and begged. Please just show me any magic. I just want to see it with my own eyes." Alpheus chuckled. "Ha ha, it's simple. I'll show you a spell that can create wind." As soon as Alpheus finished speaking, a strong gust of wind blew in and lifted Shirone into the air. It wasn't just him. Every child gathered around the headmaster was swept up as well. But while the others seemed to enjoy it, Shirone looked both terrified and confused. After reaching a certain height, Shirone and the others began to fall. While the other kids were still excited, Shirone's heart was racing from fear. It was his first time ever free falling, and from such a height, he felt like he might break apart any second. Overcome with fear, he squeezed his eyes shut. After what felt like a long time, the whooshing sound of the wind near his ears faded, replaced by the giggling of the other kids. Only then did Shirone dare to open his eyes. He found himself floating just about a meter above the ground, while the other students were teasing him for being such a scaredy cat. Alpheus, seeing this, couldn't hold back and burst into a hearty laugh. How was that? That's magic. Shirone landed safely, but his heart was still pounding with fear. So this is what magic really is. It was so advanced, so far beyond anything the book had taught him. What exactly is magic then? Headmaster, Shirone asked, still shaken by the psychological shock he had just experienced. Please explain. Alpheus stroked his long beard, seemingly searching for an easy way to explain it, but Shirone was too impatient and urged him to speak. Please, just tell me the truth. His voice was loud, and anyone who heard it might have thought he was being rude to the headmaster. The noble students nearby were shocked. No one ever dared raise their voice at Alpheus, not even the teachers. They expected Alpheus to get angry and punish Shirone. But when Alpheus looked at Shirone's smart face and bright eyes, he couldn't bring himself to get upset. Ha 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 ha. Well, since you're so eager to know, I'll explain. But it's a bit complicated. He chuckled, still stroking his beard, and began explaining to Shirone what true magic really was. It was something beyond the ordinary. In other words, a way to expand one's mind and explore the truth of the world. It's something that seems completely unreal, but could that actually bring it closer to the truth? Shirone suddenly asked. Alpheus couldn't hide the excitement on his face. What Shirone had just said was something that even the noble students here struggled to grasp. Did you read this in a book? Alpheus asked. No, sir, Shirone replied, but I noticed a pattern in many books. A lot of ideas from great minds were once considered absurd and ignored, but in the end, people had to accept those ideas as new truths that had been discovered. So I think the truth is actually hidden in those things that seem illogical. As Alpheus listened to him, he kept nodding in approval. It seemed like he was genuinely impressed by this bright, quick-thinking child. Despite the difficult circumstances, Shirone was making the most of the little information he had to understand things more deeply. It was just a shame that he was only a commoner. Ultimately, he couldn't compete with the resources the noble kids had. To help Shirone learn more about magic, Alpheus called over a pink-haired girl named Shirone and asked her to enter the spiritual world. Then, he took a handful of coins from his pocket and asked Shirone to guess how many coins he was holding. Without thinking, Shirone immediately answered with the number 6. And surprisingly, that answer was completely correct. Shirone was stunned, 100 questions running through his mind, all wondering how and why. Alpheus had a feeling that this would be Shirone's line of thinking, so he quickly began explaining. When a mage focuses, their mind becomes sharp enough to sense everything around them. Some of the more advanced mages can even count the leaves on a tree from a great distance. This is called a state of extreme sensitivity or the spiritual world. As he spoke, Alpheus continued to shuffle the coins in his hand, and once again, Shirone guessed correctly. A mage who enters the spiritual world can perceive the outside world with a supernatural ability, and eventually they can even control reality itself. It's not just about simple things like counting coins, but they can sense the entire situation happening right in front of them. This was the basic skill Alpheus wanted Shirone to master if he hoped to become a mage, because not everyone is capable of entering the spiritual state. First, you need to be able to feel yourself. Try practicing somewhere quiet, then clear your mind of any wandering thoughts. Once you can do that, a whole new world will open up for you to explore. Do you understand? So if I can't feel myself, then I won't be able to control my thoughts, right? Shirone asked again. Alpheus was continuously surprised by Shirone's questions. He told him to try to feel himself right here, right now. After all, if Shirone couldn't do that, he wouldn't get anywhere with learning magic. And what exactly is yourself? Shirone asked. Shirone was beginning to search for the answer to that question. While the brain is just an organ, the senses and the reality it perceives cannot go beyond the brain's understanding. Shirone wasn't trying to figure out its meaning, he was trying to feel it. After a long while, Shirone finally opened his eyes. In front of him were still Principal Alpheus and the group of students, but something felt different. Alpheus looked at him with eager eyes and asked, "What do you sense?" Shirone's whole body was drenched in sweat. He answered, "Sound, I can hear all the sounds." The children burst into laughter. "Of course you can hear sound," they joked. Alpheus didn't show much of an emotion, but he seemed somewhat disappointed. He had thought Shirone wouldn't be able to do exactly as he had initially expected. The things that happen in the mental world exist in a different dimension, where people experience them through entirely different senses. It was similar to synesthesia, a neurological condition where the brain processes information through multiple senses at once. In that state, a person might smell sounds, taste light, and feel the landscape with their skin. Shirone had just mentioned hearing a sound, which proved that he hadn't entered the spiritual world yet. After all, that's not something everyone can do. Alpheus slowly stood up and patted Shirone's head, offering some comfort. "Good job. If you keep practicing, you'll be able to hear even more sounds in the future." Then he turned to his students and said, "All right, the special lesson is over. Let's head back to school." As they left, Alpheus couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. It wasn't every day that he found such a smart child like Shirone. He couldn't shake the feeling that if Shirone had been born into a noble family and had proper training from an early age, he could have achieved even greater things than the other children. As for Shirone, he climbed over the wall and returned to the outside. but his mind was in complete turmoil. He knew that he had, in fact, entered the spiritual world earlier. He only told Alpheus that he had heard a sound, but there was so much more he didn't say. After that sudden jarring sound, Shirone felt like his very being was ripped apart into hundreds of pieces, scattered all over the world. In that moment, he couldn't feel like a small, insignificant person anymore. He felt like he was the entire world. The overwhelming sensation brought tears to Shirone's eyes without him even realizing it. He couldn't help but tremble, shaken by the vastness and infinity of the world around him. It was just a brief moment, but Shirone really felt like he had escaped his own body and become nothing, blending into the world around him. He was running frantically, almost as if he were trying to release all the emotions that had built up inside him. And in the chaos of it all, he accidentally crashed into a passerby. He was the only one who fell backward, since the other person was much taller and stronger. Shirone scrambled to apologize, but the man didn't seem ready to forgive him. There were a few other people with him, and the person he had bumped into immediately grabbed Shirone by the collar. "Are you crazy or something? If you hit someone, don't you have to pay for it?" I'm sorry. Shirone stuttered in a panic. "Sorry isn't enough. You're with Wolfgang, aren't you? Are you here to take my life?" Shirone had no idea what this Wolfgang was that the man was talking about, but if things kept going like this, at best, he'd get beaten up, and at worst, he might lose his life. In the middle of his panic, he suddenly heard a woman's voice. "What's going on here? Is there something interesting happening?" "Miss Amy, what are you doing here? Are you bored again?" The thug quickly turned to greet the newcomer, but still didn't let go of Shirone's collar. The girl called Lady Amy was a young noblewoman with striking red hair. Shirone had initially wanted to ask for help, but as soon as he saw she was from a noble family, he immediately gave up on that idea. As for the group of thugs, after greeting Amy, they quickly returned to their main focus. First, Shirone took a full knee to the stomach, instantly collapsing to the ground, his body shaking with pain. The fact that they were bullying a small child like Shirone didn't make these guys feel ashamed at all. Instead, it seemed to excite them. The group turned back around and started taunting Shirone with crude insults, even making vile comments about his parents. When they spoke about his parents like that, Shirone's expression changed immediately, from fear to a burning anger. The thugs noticed his shift in mood, but Shirone had no chance to retaliate, because right after, he was kicked straight in the head. A group of larger men surrounded him, beating up a defenseless child. Shirone couldn't fight back. He could only clutch his head and endure. A little while later, Amy could no longer stand by. She stepped closer and said, "Stop it. You could die like this." Then she sat down next to Shirone and asked, "Are you okay? I didn't do anything. I just happened to be passing by." Shirone, feeling a glimmer of hope from this girl, started to cry and explain what was happening. Amy simply said, "All right, stop now. Haven't you got anything more fun to do?" I thought I was going to be saved, but I didn't expect that this girl, who looked so innocent, was actually worse than those thugs. To her, Shirone was nothing more than a toy. We were planning to beat him up and then sell them to the village down south. Since he's just a commoner, there's nothing to worry about. One of the thugs spoke up with an idea. Shirone immediately sank into despair. He started regretting not staying with the vendor back then. If they really planned to sell him, was it possible he might never see his parents again? Annie stared at Shirone with a judging look for a long time before suddenly breaking into a strange smile. "Slaves shouldn't have any flaws, right? Well, then why don't I just check for myself?" The gang of thugs surrounding her burst into loud laughter. "Ha ha, Miss Amy, you're really going to check him. Hey, you hear that, kid? She's telling you to take your clothes off." As soon as Amy heard those words, her face turned pale, and she quickly took a step back. She had only meant to tease Shirone a little and then let him go. She never imagined these crazy guys were actually serious about it, and the look on Shirone's face made it seem like he was about to snap. The mocking laughter and threats of the thugs slowly faded from Shirone's mind. Instead, he began to hear the sound of a fly buzzing by, its wings flapping clearly in the air. Then, it felt like time itself had frozen. Shirone felt his mind drifting back to a few hours earlier. He saw Principal Alpheus sitting under that old tree with a group of students, reading an incantation to summon the wind, showing them what magic was like. Shirone no longer had any doubts. He was inside his own memory. Alpheus' chant became clearer in his mind, each word pouring into Shirone's head and transforming into a piece of knowledge that now belonged to him. As Shirone's soul drifted deeper into the memory world, his body in the real world stood completely still, like a wooden statue. The thugs, seeing that Shirone wasn't reacting at all, grew even angrier and grabbed him by the collar again. "You little brat, are you deaf? You think I'm playing around or what?" Only Amy noticed something was off. She quickly shouted, "Stop it." But it was too late. Shirone, guided by the memory he had just tapped into, instinctively recited the wind spell. Just like Alpheus had done earlier, he summoned a whirlwind strong enough to lift all the thugs off the ground and send them soaring into the sky. By the time Shirone came to his senses, the thugs were already falling. With such a great height, it was obvious they would end up with broken arms and legs. Shirone had taken down nearly a dozen thugs, each of them much larger than him, in a single move. The truth was, he wasn't even sure exactly how he'd done it. "Hey!" Amy shouted, running over to grab Shirone and briefly pulling him back to snap him out of it. "What the heck are you? Where did you learn magic? How does someone like you, a commoner, have magic?" At that moment, a few people, drawn by the loud noise, rushed over. Amy, feeling awkward about the crowd, quickly ran ahead. Shirone was shocked as he saw her dart up the side of the building like a squirrel, disappearing onto the rooftop. But that wasn't important right now. What mattered was that in front of Shirone was a mess, and he was sure the newcomers wouldn't give him a chance to explain. He needed to escape. He couldn't let himself be caught again, so he bolted out of the alley as fast as he could. His first time stepping out of his village had already given Shirone way too many terrifying experiences. The world felt too frightening. All he wanted was to get back into the safety of his parents' arms. That's all. Meanwhile, Amy had returned home. Her family, the Karmas family, was one of the highest-ranking noble families. She came back frustrated because a mere commoner had beaten her. Her father, Karmas Shakura, immediately knew something was wrong as soon as he saw her walk in. "Back early, huh? Did you skip school again, Amy?" "I've already learned everything, and it was boring, father." Amy snapped as she headed upstairs. Shakura sighed, exasperated with his daughter. When will you ever grow up? No matter how talented you are, it can't be so reckless. If you keep this up, one day you'll get outsmarted." Shakura was just speaking casually, but it seemed like his last comment really hit a nerve with Amy. Today she had truly been outplayed, and worse, it was by a common kid. When Shakura noticed his daughter suddenly going silent, it felt strange. Normally, if he criticized her like this, Amy would be squirming and arguing right away. But today was different. She stayed quiet for a long time and then, out of the blue, asked a question that didn't sound like her at all. "Dad, Magic, do you know anyone at the Magic Academy you could introduce me to?" After the stormy trip, Shirone had finally found his father. As soon as he spotted Vincent, he threw himself into his arms, crying and saying he had gotten lost. The two of them returned to their little village, but Shirone's attitude had changed completely since then, and winter had come. The next day, when they got back home, Vincent found his wife, Olena, sitting and knitting a scarf. She told him that Shirone had gone to the lumber yard to chop more firewood, even though a heavy snow was falling. Worried, Vincent decided to go after him. Even though they weren't father and son by blood, Vincent had raised Shirone since he was a child and considered him his own. With that fatherly bond, Vincent could clearly sense that something had changed in his son since his first trip to the city in the spring. And even though Shirone had only said he was lost, Vincent always felt like there was more to the story than that. At this moment, Shirone was in the woods chopping wood. Even though many days had passed, he still couldn't forget the day when he unknowingly unleashed magic to attack those thugs. Since then, he hadn't been able to use it again. The spell had come to him instinctively, but since he had no basic knowledge of magic, he couldn't replicate it. Despite that, Shirone had now become quite skilled at entering the spiritual world. In the spiritual world, he could sense everything. Right now, for example, he could feel, see, and even smell everything related to the tree in front of him all at once. He could even spot the tree's weakest point. This ability allowed him to swing his axe with precision, felling a tree that was 5 or 6 times taller than him with a single blow. Vincent, an experienced hunter, had witnessed the entire scene. He was certain that what he had just seen was Thunderstrike, a technique where an axe is used to chop down a tree by targeting its weak point. But how, Shirone? How could such a small, frail child do something even a skilled hunter like Vincent would have trouble pulling off? As Vincent watched his young son carefully saw through the tree trunk in the freezing winter air, he couldn't help but tear up. Meanwhile, Shirone seemed really excited. It's because this is the first time you've successfully created a thunder strike after countless attempts at chopping wood, just like the first time you summoned magic that day. Shirone knew he wasn't as lucky as the noble children, but that didn't stop him from yearning to understand the fundamentals of magic. And tomorrow, the next day, and all the days after, Shirone would continue practicing, feeling the magic within him. He believed that one day, not too far in the future, an opportunity would finally come. Persistence had truly brought Shirone some accomplishments. Time passed by like this. 3 years later, Shirone had grown taller, his hair had gotten longer, and he had perfected his thunder strike, hitting every target with unerring precision. It was as if he had become one with nature. Shirone could even sense the tremor of every bush, the movements of insects, and the flow of nutrients through the roots of each tree. But Shirone knew this wasn't everything. If I keep practicing, a new world will open up to me. Today, he had spent 5 hours meditating in the forest, working on his mental world. After reaching the results he hoped for, Shirone gathered up his firewood and headed back home. On his way back, he spotted 2 white horses. These kinds of rare, noble horses didn't usually appear in such a remote area. Outside his house, a luxurious carriage was parked. He immediately guessed that they had a visitor, but when he stepped inside, both his father and mother seemed unusually tense, which made Shirone feel a little worried. Home already? Come meet this person, Vincent called out. The owner of that fancy carriage is the butler assassin from the Ogent family. He introduced himself as Temeran. Shirone had no idea why the man had come to see him. The Ogent family was one of the most powerful, noble families in the kingdom, second only to the royal family, but Shirone still responded politely. Temeran walked over, carefully examining Shirone's face and posture, as if he were admiring a precious object. Can you read? He asked. I learned a little when I was young. Temeran seemed to think for a moment, then nodded and continued to study Shirone. You've been raised well. For the child of a hunter, you can read. You're also a well-behaved kid. Wait a minute, could you explain why you're here? Shirone asked, his patience starting to wear thin. Finally, Temeran revealed the real purpose of this trip. He was here to recruit Shirone to work for the Ogent family. Although Shirone didn't quite understand how Temeran knew about him, he listened carefully. The job was to move a total of 10,000 books out of the main library of the mansion, many of which were extremely important. This would be done over the course of 2 years. The transportation would be handled by others, but the sorting would only be done by Temeran and Shirone. As soon as Shirone heard the word library, his heart started racing. And not just any library, the library of the Ogent family. It had to be filled with knowledge that would be incredibly valuable for a mage. But then, Temeran continued. The only people who know about this are your family. If even one book gets out or word of this leaks, both your life and your families will be at risk. At that moment, Shirone finally understood why his parents had seemed so worried. Of course, given how dangerous this was, the Ogent family had agreed to pay a huge amount of money. It was a sum that Vincent could never have earned in his lifetime, even if he had spent all his years hunting. Still, Temeran didn't seem to be after the money to the point of willing to sell his precious son. He had agreed to the offer simply so his son could spend time in the Ogent library reading his heart's content. The amount of money being offered was truly enormous, which made sense considering how much effort Vincent had put into taking care of his son all these years. Temeran seemed pleased with Shirone and turned to speak to Vincent. But those words were no different from saying that Vincent had been taking care of Shirone all these years just for the money. So he immediately stood up and slammed his hand on the table. I'm not doing this for money. I just want Shirone to be able to achieve his dream, he said. Temeran suddenly burst out laughing, a harsh, mocking laugh. Ha ha, why are you overthinking this? You think that kid is going to have a career? Stop dreaming. If you're not asking me for money, then what other reason do you have for begging me to choose your son? His tone was dripping with sarcasm. Because you said he can read. Vincent nearly shouted. Looking back, Elena had only taught Shirone a few words when he was little, just for fun. But to their surprise, by the time he was 5 or 6, the boy had started reading books on his own, eager to learn. Vincent still clearly remembered how obedient and cute Shirone had been back then. But what mattered more than anything was that he was a smart kid. Every time Vincent looked into his beautiful, thoughtful eyes as Shirone sat there absorbed in his books, he couldn't help but wonder, was his adopted son from noble blood? And if he had been raised by a noble family instead of a family of hunters like theirs, would his life have turned out better? During those days, Vincent had wrestled with these thoughts, struggling deeply within himself. One side of him just wanted to keep Shirone to himself and raise him to be a hunter, a woodcutter like he was. But whenever he saw Shirone spending hours in the forest chopping wood tirelessly, it made him uncomfortable. So it was Vincent who decided to approach Temeran after hearing that the Ogent family was looking for a commoner's child who could read. All Vincent wanted was for Shirone to go there and read the books he desired. That's why he went to beg Temeran. But he didn't expect this arrogant man to think Vincent was trying to sell his child for money. That really made Vincent furious. I don't need any of your money. If I knew you'd look at me like that, I wouldn't have come here to beg you. Now get out of my house immediately. Temeran, too, was proud and arrogant. When Vincent insulted him like that, he turned to leave. But just as his foot was at the door, Shirone quickly called him back. He said he would take the job, no matter how dangerous it was or how much Temeran might look down on his family for it. Are you serious? I'm not threatening you. But just so you know, even the smallest rumor could cost you your life, Temeran warned. Even then, Shirone stood firm. He insisted he could keep quiet no matter the situation, and if anything went wrong, he wouldn't blame Temeran or the Ogent family. Seeing the determination in the young man's eyes, Temeran didn't try to talk him out of it anymore. He said he'd send a car to pick up Shirone within the next week. During this time, if you change your mind and refuse, that's fine. But once Shirone steps foot in the Ojit mansion, he won't be able to leave until the task is complete. After giving Shirone his instructions, Tengaran didn't stay long. Only the 3 members of the family were left, and it was Vincent who, in a panic, rushed to his son. Shirone, why did you agree to something like this? Those bastards just need someone to take the fall for them. This is my fault. I'll take responsibility, so you should refuse right now. Vincent's face was drenched in tears, and at that moment, Shirone started crying too. But he wasn't crying because he blamed Vincent for pushing him into danger. Instead, he cried out of gratitude, knowing that his father had given him such an incredible gift. Stepping into the Ojin family library and reading its rare magical books was an opportunity Shirone had never even dared to dream of in his lifetime. Dad, thank you so much. Shirone was crying, but there was a bright smile on his face. Vincent quickly pulled him into a tight hug, repeatedly reassuring him. Don't worry, Shirone, and remember you have to come back in one piece. I promise you they won't lay a finger on any of us. In that moment, Vincent honestly didn't know if he was making the right decision. Elena couldn't hold back her tears, overwhelmed with worry for her son. But if Shirone had made up his mind to leave, neither of them could stop him. A week later, Tengaran kept his word and sent someone to pick up Shirone. After having Vincent sign an agreement, they hurriedly took him away. The carriage door shut, and it began to move. Shirone quickly entered his own spiritual world. He could see Vincent and Olena holding each other, crying uncontrollably. Deep down, Shirone wanted to reach out to them, but the last bit of reason stopped him from doing so. Yes, this opportunity was a double-edged sword. Even though working for the Ojin family was dangerous, it would also offer Shirone many things. He knew he couldn't back down anymore. Speaking of the Ojin family, their main estate was located in the city of Kreese, within the kingdom of Formia, which was quite far from the capital, Bashuka. The Ojin family was known for producing skilled warriors, particularly professional swordsmen. The previous family head was a level 3 swordsman, and the current family head was Bishop Ojin, a level 4 knight. In short, they had the power to influence the most powerful forces in the city. How much time had passed, Shirone wasn't sure, but the carriage eventually arrived in front of the Ojin estate. This was Shirone's first time stepping into a noble family, and not just any noble family, but a high-ranking one with considerable influence in the kingdom. The grandeur and magnificence of the place completely overwhelmed him. The 2 people in charge of welcoming Shirone took him to the administrative office, which also served as the butler's quarters. This would be Shirone's home for the next 2 years. Waiting there was Tengaran. He didn't give Shirone any time to rest, but immediately led him to the family's grand library to explain the tasks Shirone would need to take on. As soon as Shirone stepped into the Ojin family library, he was even more astonished. He had never seen so many books in one place before. For someone who loved books as much as Shirone, this was a dream come true. The Ojin family had recently built a new library, so all the books from the old one were being moved there, and Shirone's job would be to organize them. Every week, he'd receive a list of books to locate and gather according to their titles. Work hours were from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day. Outside of those hours, Shirone was allowed to rest, but he wasn't permitted to leave the estate or enter certain areas without permission. Tengaran, as the head butler, would be busier than the others, but other butlers would teach Shirone the proper etiquette required to be part of this noble family. Do you have any questions? Tengaran asked. Shirone was still processing the information the other person had just shared with him. He realized that this was truly a chance worth taking a risk for. When do I start working? Shirone responded with a question of his own. Starting tomorrow. And just like that, the next morning, Shirone put on a brand new butler's uniform, grabbed a list of tasks, and headed to the Grand Library. After a whole night of deep thinking, he finally understood why the Ojin family, despite being so wealthy and powerful, only hired one person to manage the book organization. It was likely because they needed a consistent system for arranging the books. For example, if they had a book titled The History of Swordsmanship, everyone would have a different opinion on whether it should be placed under professional sword techniques or comprehensive history. Another thing Shirone realized as he worked through the library's organization systems was that all knowledge is interconnected, and the most fundamental way to link it all together is through history. Knowledge is built up in a straight line, and that line's backbone is history. History is the spine of all knowledge. After thoroughly studying history and using it to reinforce other areas of knowledge, Shirone's reading speed also increased significantly. Out of the 10,000 books in the library, around 850 were history books. He planned to read all of them within the next 2 years so he could achieve his biggest dream, to become a wizard. Time passed slowly, and Shirone quickly adapted to his new job. That evening, while reading a book in the library, he heard footsteps. It's Tengaran, along with a butler, he thought. Shirone quickly hid the book in his hands. After all, it wasn't allowed for him to be reading here. Have you taken care of everything? Are you working overtime again? Yes, sir, Shirone answered quickly, standing up straight and replying seriously. Tamarin didn't question him and simply advised Shirone not to overwork himself. After all, he still had 2 years left at this library. More importantly, he needed to take full responsibility for everything he did. If you wear yourself out and make mistakes, your head might roll before you know it. After leaving a new list of tasks, Tamarin started to leave, but after walking a few steps, he suddenly turned around and walked straight towards Shirone, making him tense up. What's this? Did he find out I've been sneaking in books to read during overtime? Luckily, Tamarin just came in to adjust the bow tie around Shirone's neck. This library wasn't just for the butler. Even the family head and the young masters came by from time to time. Pay attention to your uniform and make sure you're not making the family look bad. Ojin Tamarin also reminded Shirone to trim his long hair. After that, he actually left. Shirone sighed with relief. He started thinking about tying his hair up like his father did, but there was something else on his mind: how difficult the information in the books was. Once Tamarin and the assistant butler had left, Shirone went back to struggling with the massive amount of information. He had hoped to memorize it quickly, but if he wanted to access the knowledge in a book anytime, he had to truly understand every event in it. So he kept cramming more and more words into his head. But he already worked nonstop all day. It didn't take long before the exhaustion took over, and he slumped forward, falling asleep at the desk. By the time he was sound asleep, a hand reached out and took the book he'd been reading. It was Tamarin, who had somehow come back without Shirone noticing. "Ha, you're really an idiot," he muttered, clicking his tongue. "You've been holding on to this book for a whole month. You think you can succeed just by studying? If you were reading practical books, I'd have banned you from coming here outside of work hours. Still, I guess it's a good thing, because all you are is a fool with determination." 3 months have passed, and Shirone has begun to adjust to working at the Ojin family's grand library. He's learned a lot from the maids during this time. After these 3 months, Shirone also realized something. The noble class doesn't really care if 1 or 2 books go missing. This likely means that no book in the library is all that important. But that didn't mean Shirone would be any safer. So he kept the same mindset he had when Tamarin first came to him. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. While Shirone was lost in thought, the door to the library suddenly flew open, followed by a voice that pierced his eardrums. "Damn it, that old bastard." He jumped in surprise and looked up. The person who had barged in was a young man with green hair and a tall, broad frame. From what Shirone knew, this was the youngest son of the Ojin family, Ryan Ojin. Then, another voice echoed in, and this one sounded even more terrifying. "Ryan, how dare you run away? When I catch you, you'll have to run an extra 100 laps." Ryan quickly dashed towards Shirone and crawled under the table next to him. Before hiding, he made sure to remind Shirone not to tell the person coming that he was hiding there. Ryan's large frame had already put a lot of pressure on Shirone, but the next person to enter the library was even bigger. "I know you're hiding in here, Ryan. Hey, over there, a little kid with green hair about the size of a pea just barged in here, didn't he?" Shirone was at a loss for words. If that kid with green hair is as small as a pea, then what does that make your skinny frame in my old eyes? But still, that guy looks pretty scary. Shirone realized he needed to figure out who this guy was before anything else. "Excuse me, may I ask who you are?" "I'm a swordsmanship instructor. I'm the one who's allowed to beat that pea-sized kid into dust." "Got it?" The words "got it" practically pierced Shirone's eardrums. He felt like if he didn't answer, this old man might just bury him where he stood. So despite the youngest master's warnings, Shirone had no choice but to admit that the kid was hiding under the bookshelf next to them. The swordsmanship teacher grabbed Ryan by the collar with one hand and yanked him out. "Master, this is just a misunderstanding." Ryan panicked, trying to explain, but the old man didn't give him a chance. With a swift motion, he threw Ryan to the ground and then grabbed his leg, dragging him off. "Follow me, you good for nothing. Skipping your training, you need a lesson in discipline." Ryan looked utterly defeated. Shirone could clearly read his lips when he spoke to him then. Ryan said, "You'll pay for this." However, seeing Ryan's swordsmanship style, which seemed even more powerful than the family head's, Shirone knew this was the only path for him to follow. After that day, Shirone overheard some gossip. The youngest young master was captured and taken to the mountain to train. Because of that, no one burst into the library and startled him anymore. In the days that followed at the Grand Library, Shirone continued to complete his tasks while also making time to read books. He finished the first book in 20 days, but after fully understanding its content, he went on to read 82 more books in just 4 months. Everything was progressing just as Shirone had expected, although the beginning was a bit difficult. After that, there wasn't a single book that contained entirely new material. If he could establish a solid foundation with the first 200 books, the remaining 650 books would be much easier to grasp. As Shirone read books about the history and origins of magic, he began to question, is studying the history of magic at this point really the right choice? But since he had already studied the formation of all things before, he became even more confident that this was the right decision. After all, if a scholar can create a theorem, a wizard does the same. However, they must also bring that theory into practice and apply it in the real world. So, a wizard is similar to a scholar. However, not every scholar is a wizard. That's because not everyone can enter a state of divine awareness in their consciousness, which is the realm of the spirit. Because of this, Shirone believed even more strongly that, with his own spiritual world, if he could absorb a large amount of knowledge from the books he had, he might truly become a wizard. He thought the peaceful days he had would last forever. That was until that night, Ryan stormed back in a fit of rage. "Hey kid, I crossed hell just to wait for this day." With his familiar green hair, tall build, and that day-fitting voice, Shirone quietly broke into a cold sweat. This young master sure was persistent. After going through that harsh training on the mountain, he still hadn't forgotten the grudge Shirone exposed in the library. Ryan was so furious his teeth were grinding together. "Do you have any idea how much trouble I had to go through, you little bastard?" With that, he began to rant about how his master had tortured him, climbing cliffs over and over again until his fingers were too weak to even move. Yet, every time Ryan thought he was going to die, he remembered the grudge from the library, the one that pushed him into this miserable situation, and it gave him a strange surge of strength. Shirone sighed to himself. This young master isn't just upset. It seems like his anger has been building up for a while and has now reached its peak. "Aren't you going to say anything? I asked for your help and trusted you, but you turned on me and reported me to the master. Every time I see a little coward like you, it just makes me sick." As he spoke, Ryan grabbed Shirone by the collar. "It's not like that. I'm just telling the truth. Don't try to justify yourself. You should be admitting that you didn't follow my orders back then." Shirone quietly sighed. It seemed like he couldn't reason with someone who was this angry and had the power to crush him. "So, what should I do, sir?" Ryan seemed surprised by Shirone's calm response. Then he burst out laughing and dragged Shirone to the training grounds, even though it was already well past midnight. Shirone thought Ryan might want to use a sword to beat him out of frustration. He didn't want to risk losing the opportunity his parents had nearly died for, so he decided to just take whatever punishment Ryan had in store. However, after a while of looking over the weapons hanging on the rack, Ryan randomly grabbed a wooden sword and tossed it to Shirone. He told Shirone to fight him one-on-one. "I'm not weak like you. This is the price you'll pay for underestimating me. Anyone destined to become a great swordsman will have to face the wrath of my blade. I haven't done anything cowardly." Shirone, feeling a bit riled up after Ryan's constant taunts, fired back. "As a servant of the Ogent family, you should have been protecting the Ogent family members. However, you betrayed me and the master just because you were afraid of getting punished. Isn't that cowardice?" When Ryan said this, Shirone could clearly feel the change in his gaze. It had turned sharper, almost vicious. Shirone instinctively gripped the sword tighter in his hand, and that's exactly what Ryan wanted. Hear the huge difference in skill between them. Ryan had given Shirone a head start with 3 free moves. Shirone was extremely nervous. Even though it was just a wooden sword, which wouldn't kill him, the wood was tough. If he broke a bone, he would be sent home and lose this job for good. A question kept spinning in his mind. What should I do now? After a few seconds of intense thought, Shirone tightened his grip and launched a powerful strike, but Ryan easily dodged it. When Shirone tried again, Ryan blocked his attack with his own sword. Unlike Shirone, whose hands were shaking as he held the sword, Ryan was clearly more experienced with much superior strength. Sweat poured down Shirone's neck. He only had one more chance to land a successful strike. If he failed this time, he would lose for good. Shirone focused all of his energy and entered the world of his spirit. In this state, he could sense the weak spot on Ryan's sword, just like the times when he had successfully created lightning strikes while chopping wood. Once he pinpointed the target, Shirone launched his attack without hesitation. Ryan immediately raised his sword to block the blow and even mocked Shirone, laughing at how ridiculous his stance was. But when Shirone's sword came down, Ryan couldn't laugh anymore because the sword in his hand was instantly shattered into pieces. Ryan looked absolutely horrified. He stared at the broken fragments of his sword for a long time, still in shock. Shirone's sword had also broken, but he had succeeded. Ryan had given him 3 chances, and Shirone used the first one to feel out Ryan's strength, the second to calculate his opponent's timing, and then executed his plan with the 3rd strike. This was the lightning strike technique he had been practicing for 3 years. "Hey," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "Where did you learn swordsmanship?" This isn't swordsmanship, it's just lightning strike, Shirone replied honestly. Ha! Seeing Ryan's confused expression, Shirone patiently explained that his father was a hunter, and since he was young, he had gone with him to chop wood on the mountain. Because his body was too weak, he couldn't chop wood the usual way. That's when he came up with this technique to make the work easier. The technique was named lightning strike by the woodcutters. The more Ryan listened, the more confused he became. How could someone come up with such a powerful move while chopping wood? And to think he had been wielding a sword for 15 years, only to lose to the son of a poor woodcutter. Moreover, what Shirone just called Thunder Strike was actually the Assassin's Blade technique, a secret skill from the Ojin family that Ryan's older brother Rai had learned when he was just 12 years old. Back then, Ryan had been defeated by Rai using the very same technique. Today, he was beaten again by Shirone, who used that same skill. I won't accept this, Ryan muttered under his breath. His fists clenched tightly, and he couldn't hold back any longer, shouting in frustration. Seeing his opponent's increasingly serious expression, Shirone, who had just begun to relax, instantly tensed up again. Young master, have I displeased you? Shirone asked cautiously. Shut up, Ryan snapped. Then he drew another sword from his side. This time it was a real sword, and he threw it towards Shirone. Since both of our weapons were destroyed, this battle isn't over yet. If you've mastered the Assassin's Blade technique, I should treat you accordingly. Shirone's heart nearly leaped out of his chest. Please don't tell me the young master is losing his mind and actually wants to duel with me using a real sword. Fortunately, Ryan hadn't completely lost his sanity. The duel with real swords was a serious matter, but before that, Ryan would give Shirone a whole month to prepare. A month may seem like a long time, but for someone like Shirone, who had no background in swordsmanship, it was essentially useless. Holding the sword in his hands, Shirone's entire body trembled uncontrollably. If it's a real sword, then you really could be my opponent, Ryan said coldly. Shirone didn't want to risk his life, so he begged Ryan to reconsider. After all, he had never trained in swordsmanship, so how could he possibly fight with a sword? But Ryan had no intention of taking back his words. That's exactly why I'm giving you a month. If you're capable of mastering the deadly sword technique just by chopping firewood, then somehow you'll manage to do it. And don't even think about running away. I'm sure I'll catch up with you. The sword in Shirone's hand wasn't particularly heavy, but it felt as though it was crushing his heart. After returning to the Grand Library and gathering information, Shirone finally understood why the youngest son had reacted so nervously. People from the Ojin family were known for having two distinct hair colors, black and blue. The head of the family, Ojin Bikoff, had black hair and fathered 3 sons and 1 daughter. His eldest son also had black hair and was already a level 6 swordsman. His eldest daughter had blue hair and was exceptionally talented in music, so instead of following the family's swordsmanship tradition, she worked as a musician in the palace. The second son, Ajit Rai, also had black hair. He learned the deadly sword technique at the age of 12 and was considered a genius. But Ryan Ojit was believed to be completely different from his siblings. The household staff all agreed that he was rather unremarkable, despite having his own personal instructor. Shirone felt completely devastated. He started to regret not letting Ryan use a wooden sword to beat him, senseless back then. Instead, he had resisted, and now everything had turned out this way. Ryan's pride had been seriously hurt, and it seemed like the only way he'd be able to shake off the mental burden was to defeat Shirone in a real fight. Shirone had even cried from the stress. If he were to lose his life in the battle against Ryan a month from now, his parents would never be able to live in peace again. Thinking about his parents, Shirone couldn't allow himself to stay down any longer. Think, you're going to be a mage, Shirone, he thought to himself. With renewed determination, he began searching for books in the library. Back when he lived on the mountain, Shirone had been very confident in his physical strength. He believed that as long as he learned a few defensive skills, he could survive. So he started studying everything within his reach. Meanwhile, Ryan had thrown himself into intense training. His sudden enthusiasm shocked his swordsmanship master. Even the student who had always avoided training now asked for more grueling methods to push himself harder. The swordsmanship master wasn't foolish. He quickly realized something had happened with Ryan, but when he asked, Ryan simply replied that nothing was wrong. Seeing Ryan's determination, the man didn't press him further. Instead, he began giving him a much more intense, grueling training plan, far tougher than anything before. While Ryan was sweating buckets on the training field, Shirone was carefully studying the concept of Luck-Du force map. It was considered a simple diagram of the human body. Just as magicians had their Lin-Vuk magic domain, swordsmen used Luck-Du to help visualize their bodies. This map could push their limits to the extreme. A person who mastered Luck-Du would be able to use and control every cell in their body perfectly. This was the key to becoming a true swordsman. This aspect was completely different from the Lin Vuk Shirone had unlocked, but it also intrigued him. Should I give it a try? Shirone thought to himself. And with that, he made up his mind. Shirone closed the book in his hands, shut his eyes, and began focusing inward. This was the first step in unlocking the Luck Du, and it was relatively simple, much like entering a Lin Vuk. However, while unlocking a Lin Vuk required someone to erase their sense of self, unlocking the Luck Du required them to dig deep into their own existence. In truth, Shirone didn't want to put all his effort into Luck Du, since it was the opposite of the Lin Vuk. So he decided to shift his focus and started learning some basic swordsmanship techniques using the foundation of his existing Lin Vuk. Shirone grabbed a pile of sword technique books and headed to the backyard. He began with the most basic drills, the 8 fundamental sword slashes. At the same time, Ryan was pushing himself to train so hard that even his swordsmanship teacher was starting to worry. He had never seen his students so worked up before, even though he had been teaching him since he was a child. Ryan's emotions were all over the place. In truth, Shirone was just the final straw. The real issue was that Ryan had always been compared to his older siblings, and the fact that he had been training in swordsmanship for 15 years without unlocking his true potential made him feel like a failure in the Ojin family. His teacher, though strict in appearance, was actually very caring. Today, seeing his students' terrifying transformation, he was genuinely moved to tears. Ryan, that's enough. Let's stop here for today. The sword in Ryan's hand was gently taken away by his teacher. At that moment, Ryan realized how sore his muscles had become. He put the sword down obediently, then sat down and stared off into the distance. "What are you thinking about?" Ryan's teacher asked, wiping the sweat off his face. "I'm thinking my hands hurt so much I just want to quit," Ryan replied. His teacher continued, "You know, I never knew you could push yourself this far, but I think you've done really well. Have you ever stopped to think about what the best thing you've ever done is?" He suddenly asked, "I don't know. I only know that what I do isn't good enough." "Yeah, that's exactly it. That's why you're not a genius," his teacher replied. Ryan felt frustrated. He thought his teacher was mocking him, but when he turned to look, he saw the teacher's face was serious, his eyes filled with deep thought. The teacher explained that all geniuses know what they are best at, and they only put in the effort when they are 100% sure they will succeed at it. However, geniuses also have one fear: the hard work needed to achieve the impossible, a burning will to challenge what seems unattainable. That will and determination are the kryptonite of geniuses. "Thank you, Master," Ryan said with a faint smile. "Out of all the encouragement you've heard, I think you'll like these words the most," his teacher replied. His swordsmanship instructor wasn't just speaking casually. Those words had truly sparked Ryan's fighting spirit, making him believe that if talent wasn't something he was born with, then he would grit his teeth and forge it through relentless training. Ryan was determined to turn the impossible into something possible. He wanted to win. And by coincidence, that was also the mindset of Shirone, who was struggling with basic swordsmanship training at that very moment. Shirone was taking his first steps into swordsmanship with full seriousness. Swordsmanship is all about learning how to perform actions that can take another person's life. The flip side of this is that it becomes a highly intense psychological battle over life and death. Since he didn't have a sparring partner, Shirone could only grip the sword Ryan had thrown him, imagining an invisible enemy in front of him, one that could strike from countless angles. In reality, when fighting with a sword, there are 8 main directions of attack. Through his extraordinary effort, Shirone had taught himself these 8 cuts as well as how to counter them. He practiced relentlessly, and eventually he realized that the path of swordsmanship was as limitless as magic itself. The amount of knowledge he had gained so far seemed no more than a grain of sand in the vast desert. "Mom, Dad, I'm sorry, but I don't think I'll be able to come home this time," Shirone said quietly, his voice full of sorrow. But since joining the Ojin family, he had never regretted his decision. Even though the path he walked was one that brought him face to face with death, it also allowed him to witness a truly amazing world. A month passed by in the blink of an eye. Shirone arrived at the training grounds on time, ready for his life or death duel with Ryan. In just one short month, he could clearly feel that the aura around his opponent had completely changed. Ryan, too, noticed the difference in Shirone. Just a month ago, he'd appeared disorganized both in stance and balance. Now, Shirone was calm and composed, and even though it was his first time holding a real sword, he was completely at ease. This made Ryan unable to stop comparing Shirone to his older brother Rai, and it only made Ryan want to win even more. Ryan is the one who charges first. Shirone was incredibly tense. Even though the servants often said Ryan was useless, the young master's swordsmanship was on a completely different level compared to his own. But luckily, thanks to the relentless training over the past month, Shirone was still able to sense the direction of Ryan's blade. Shirone's calmness and the way he observed the path of Ryan's sword only made Ryan more fired up. Is he not afraid of this blade? Ryan wondered to himself, feeling confused. In reality, Shirone wasn't reckless or fearless. He had just completely mastered controlling his emotions. On the other side, Ryan continued his assault. This time, the sword came from the right. Shirone managed to block it again. The first few strikes were light, but with each successive swing, Ryan's speed increased, eventually surpassing Shirone's ability to sense the sword's direction. Finally, the tip of Ryan's sword managed to leave a shallow gash across Shirone's chest. As blood began to flow, Shirone knew he was about to lose. Quickly, he changed his approach, gathering all his strength to retreat. Along with the sharp pain in his chest, a deep confusion lingered in his mind. Ryan looked into his opponent's eyes as if he understood the confusion. This made him even more pleased with himself. The technique he had just used was the Ojin sword technique to master the great sword. Every strike was the result of Ryan pushing himself to the limit, so the power behind each slash was completely different from a regular sword skill. After injuring Shirone, he became even more aggressive. In Ryan's eyes, there was only one goal now: to crush Shirone with his strength. They charged into the second round, but this time, Shirone was left feeling even more confused. If Ryan had slashed upward after landing a hit to his chest, Shirone would have been cut along the side. But the next attacks from Ryan didn't seem like finishing blows. This meant that Ryan's understanding of swordsmanship wasn't as advanced as Shirone had thought. Ryan could swing a sword well, but he couldn't fully grasp how to use the techniques effectively. That was the opening Shirone needed to turn the tide. Without hesitation, Shirone changed his battle strategy and put all his energy into attacking. He had learned the basics of swordplay, so his strikes were sharp and decisive. Once again, Ryan was left in shock. Why is he attacking all of a sudden? Isn't he supposed to be exhausted? Ryan thought to himself, utterly bewildered. Ryan grew even more confused when he saw that the moves Shirone was using were actually quite simple, yet he couldn't block them. Ryan, who had been aggressively attacking from the high ground, suddenly found himself on the defensive. Noticing that his opponent's stamina was slowly fading after several clumsy blocks, Shirone felt a renewed hope of surviving this fight. All he needed to do was keep his energy up and maintain this steady rhythm of attacks, and he could win. Meanwhile, Ryan's mind was in turmoil. Shirone's pressure was bringing back haunting memories from the past. Ryan remembered his older brother Rai, who had been praised by their father as a genius, and the one who had defeated Ryan with a deadly sword technique. Thinking back to his brother's arrogant smile, full of smug satisfaction after beating him, Ryan's anger flared up again, and this time he directed all that rage towards Shirone. Ryan's sudden loss of composure made Shirone momentarily think he had given up, but just as quickly, a new problem arose. Ryan may have lost his calm, but his burst of anger had made his sword swings much faster. They came so fast that Shirone couldn't keep up with all the directions the blade was coming from. In that final strike, Shirone truly felt like death itself had come to tap him on the shoulder. But with such a strong main character aura, of course, the young man wasn't going to die. Neither of them landed a hit. Because Ryan's sword had been knocked aside by Shirone's, he stood there, dazed in a way that didn't make sense. Shirone, on the other hand, was so exhausted he could barely catch his breath. Ryan could clearly see that in the final move, Shirone had read the direction of his sword, and in the blink of an eye, he had changed his grip. Shirone's sword tip had risen, meeting the descending blade of Ryan's in a direct clash. With the last of his strength, Shirone had defeated Ryan by knocking his sword out of his hand. Shirone gasped for air, still trying to process it. He had won, but couldn't quite believe it. Even though Shirone had truly won, he still felt awkward. After all, even though it was just a spar, Ryan was still a noble, and once again, he had crushed the pride that was already so high for someone like him. Shirone couldn't help but wonder what Ryan might do next. Shirone was tense. He couldn't even imagine how furious Ryan might be now, but to his surprise, Ryan didn't seem angry. Instead, he lowered his head and muttered 3 words. I lost. Before Shirone could even react, Ryan scratched his head and repeated the same 3 words multiple times, now sounding flustered. I lost and you won. Since I've lost, if you want to take my life, I won't have anything to say about it. Shirone was a bit taken aback. He didn't expect Ryan to accept defeat so readily, even offering his life so casually. But he was still a noble. There was no way Shirone could come out of this unscathed if he even touched a hair on Ryan's head. What ridiculous thing are you saying, young master? Shirone almost raised his voice in disbelief. We fought with our lives on the line and I've already admitted that I lost. So, you have every right to take my life, don't you? Shirone responded in a bewildered tone. You're the one who wanted to gamble your life on this. As for me, I just want to stay alive. Shirone shouted, from the very beginning, I thought this whole fight was ridiculous. Why are you blaming me and wanting to hit me, when you're the one who ran away from your master just because you didn't want to train? The anger surged in Shirone's mind, and without fear, he directly criticized the young master in front of him. Ryan, not willing to back down, immediately fired back with his sharp tongue. Hold on a second, you piece of garbage. Who exactly should be blaming who, huh? It's all because you're a coward. Even if this was the first time we met, and we met under those circumstances, you still should have respected me, don't you think? Respect? Are you kidding me? Shirone interrupted. Have you ever thought about how badly you made me feel? I was caught between the son of the family head and your swordsmanship master. If you really deserved respect, you wouldn't have put someone as small and powerless as me in a situation like that. Shirone's anger only grew as he vented all of his frustration, shouting at Ryan with all his might. To be honest, this young master is a real fool. The reason he wanted to challenge Shirone wasn't because he wanted to put him in a life or death situation, but because of his oversized ego. As for Shirone, he really thought this might be the end for him. After letting Ren have it with a long rant, he was so exhausted that he collapsed onto the ground. On the other side, Ryan had just been scolded by the servants in his household, left speechless and unable to respond. But what was strange was that he wasn't angry at all. In that moment, as Shirone was venting, Ryan felt like the calm, cold warrior he had just faced was suddenly gone. In his place was just a teenager, probably around his own age. And the most important thing was, even though Ryan felt Shirone was definitely a genius, he didn't mock him the way Rai had. Instead, Shirone gave his all to face Ryan, not just to protect himself, but also to show respect to his opponent. Because of all this, Ryan began to see the young man in front of him in a different light. Hey, what's your name? He suddenly asked. Aryan Shirone. Shirone didn't really know what Ryan was getting at, but he answered enthusiastically. I'm Ulgent Ryan, Ryan said clearly. Shirone once again felt confused. Who didn't know that this green-haired young man was Ulgent Ryan? The confusion reached its peak when Ryan suddenly reached out to pull Shirone to his feet, along with a surprising offer. Let's make friends together. And just like that, the duel between the two of them came to an end. Shirone returned to his work. In the blink of an eye, a year had passed since he first stepped into the Ulgent mansion, and by then, he had already categorized 7,028 out of 10,453 books. His progress far exceeded expectations. Even someone as critical as Tengaran couldn't help but leave a compliment. Since there were fewer books left to sort, Shirone's efficiency improved even more. What's more, his goal of reading all 850 history books was now down to just 200. Every day he read 3 books, and soon enough, Shirone would complete the foundation of knowledge he had always dreamed of. Not only that, but thanks to Ryan, he had also gotten to experience swordsmanship and understood the true nature of fear. As a result, it seemed like Shirone's endurance in the spiritual realm had grown stronger. Though his start had been slow, he knew that as long as he didn't give up, he would eventually reach his goal. And most importantly, Shirone had found his very first true friend in life, the same person who had yelled at him the first time they met. After that final showdown, Ryan pretty much set up camp at the Grand Library to talk with Shirone. He also started to realize that Shirone was more emotional and had some surprisingly cute sides to him, totally opposite to his towering, intimidating appearance. Although Ryan still sometimes acted in ways that gave Shirone a headache, like messing up piles of books he had just sorted. Overall, his friend was pretty valuable. But after they became close, Ryan started to get lazy with his training. Like today, after finishing the basics, he turned to his master and said, I want to go to the library and just hang out there. Shirone knew that the seemingly lazy guy was actually a smoldering fire that could flare up at any moment. Ryan would get stronger whenever he had the chance, so there was no need to push him too hard with his training. So, Shirone agreed to let Ryan stay in the library and read with him. But just 10 minutes later, Ryan was already getting bored with all the words in the books. He sighed and said, Shirone, didn't you say you wanted to become a magician? Do you really have to read that many books? 800 volumes? You're crazy. Shirone replied, Of course. Actually, I'm behind. Before I came here, I didn't have any chance to study. But now that I've read over 600 history books, I pretty much know everything. Ryan wasn't interested in reading, so he just focused on watching Shirone, and every time he saw him working, he couldn't help but be amazed all over again. Shirone's reading speed was unbelievably fast, so much so that Ryan felt like Shirone could get completely absorbed in the book at any moment. Out of boredom, Ryan would read a few lines and then start chatting with Shirone. The two of them were fine as long as they were close, like a couple of people at a busy market. Because of this, Shirone couldn't focus on his reading. They started debating the book Ryan was holding. It was about the most common comparison made on the continent. If a swordsman and a mage faced off, who would win? Of course, the swordsman would win. Then a voice came from behind the bookshelf. As soon as Shirone heard it, he jumped to his feet. The voice belonged to Ojent Rai, the second young master of the Ojent family, also the older brother that Ryan hated with a passion. Shirone became tense, worried that Rai might have overheard their conversation. If a servant dared to speak out of line with the noble family's children, they wouldn't be easily forgiven. Rai's stare right now felt like it could pierce through him. Noticing Shirone's discomfort, Ryan quickly spoke up to cover for him. Why are you acting like you already know the outcome? Are you sure you're not just picking the swordsman because you're one yourself? Oh, I didn't think you care so much about something like this. Considering the status of swordsmen and mages on the continent, it's pretty obvious. Ryan laughed loudly. We're talking about combat here. What does their rank have to do with anything? Do you think people choose their positions on the battlefield based on their military rank? I'm sure you're not about to say something that ridiculous, right? Ryan's attitude was clearly defiant, but Jia didn't seem to care. Instead, he turned towards Shirone, who was standing nearby. Oh, you there. What do you think? It was a simple question, but Shirone could feel an invisible pressure coming from Jia. He couldn't tell if there was any deeper intention behind the question, or if he failed to give the answer Jia wanted, whether he'd be safe or not. Still, Shirone couldn't ignore the question. He hesitantly shared his opinion. He believed that if a swordsman and a mage had the same skill level, the swordsman would struggle once the mage entered their magical domain. However, if the swordsman used his superior physical strength to fight before the mage could enter that domain, he might still have a chance to win. No, you're wrong. Rai interrupted Shirone. At some point, he had moved right in front of Shirone. The man was taller than Shirone, so his presence felt even more overwhelming. You're wrong. The mage will lose. As he said this, a smug smile spread across his face. That familiar, superior attitude made Ryan's blood boil. Rai had been like this since they were kids. Whenever he disliked someone, he enjoyed stomping on what they held dear. It used to be Rai bullying others, but now he was trying to pressure Shirone. You seem to enjoy history, don't you? I'm sure you've heard of the five gods' armor, right? Those holy relics that can break a mage's mental world. I'm talking about anti-magic. Shirone froze at Rai's words. A mage's natural ability is their spiritual domain, right? Fighting a mage within their own domain is like battling a school of sharks in the deep sea. But there is one thing that can stir the waters and distract the sharks. That's where the anti-magic Rai just mentioned comes in. If a spiritual world can be affected, then magic can't be used either. Once someone possesses a holy relic with this attribute, a mage can do nothing against them. But in the end, that's still just a theory. In the past, resistance to magic was a valuable power created from the flow of mana in a dragon's heart. Just this alone made it highly sought after. Moreover, due to wave frequency fluctuations, no amount of wealth could enhance its effectiveness. Even master wizards could only harness up to 65% of the power of the five gods. Therefore, the price to obtain sacred artifacts was incredibly steep. Of course, in modern times, it also holds historical value. As a result, the worth of magic resistance is equivalent to the budget of an entire kingdom over years. However, the most confusing issue here is that those who create magic resistance are also wizards themselves. They produce things that go against their own kind because the demand is so high, making it easy to profit from it. These wizards are lining up, waiting to be employed. Wizards are just a profession where pitiful people sell their own weaknesses for money, Rai said with a tone of disdain. Ryan felt extremely frustrated because he knew Shirone dreamed of becoming a wizard, while Rai openly insulted that profession. Yet, the one who should have been angry, Shirone, seemed largely unfazed emotionally. That's the nature of wizards after all. Suddenly, he broke into a bright smile and said, Shirone's attitude surprised both Ojin brothers, especially Rai. What could you say? He thought he must have heard wrong and asked again. You're not wrong, sir. Anti-magic was indeed created by wizards. It's used to limit the effects of magic in areas where magic is forbidden, and it's also effectively used to assist in training magic students. Shirone's understanding was just as strong as Rai's. He knew that anti-magic was indeed meant to counteract wizards, but its existence represented an intellectual achievement aimed at serving good purposes. Because of this, Shirone maintained his viewpoint that Rada's belief that swordsmen were nobler than wizards was a misguided and narrow-minded opinion. Rai, known as the second son of the Ojin family, was used to ridiculing others. Today, in his own home, he found himself rebutted by Shirone's calm tone. Yet, Shirone's demeanor was entirely appropriate, leaving Rai unable to find any faults. The theory you're talking about and reality are two completely different things. No matter what, the truth is that wizards will never beat swordsmen, Rai said before huffily walking away. At that moment, Shirone let out a sigh of relief. When Ryan appeared looking so menacing, he thought he was in real trouble. Ryan was also quite pleased, as he was happy to finally have someone strong enough to throw shade at Rai for him. After that event, Rai stopped coming to the library to cause trouble. As a result, Shirone had more time to focus on his work. 6 months later, as winter arrived, he had completed the task of categorizing more than 10,000 books. He finished the job 6 months ahead of schedule. Tamarin seemed very relieved that the books, which had been neglected for 20 years, were finally organized. Shirone had finished his task so he could go home. However, a butler from the Ojin family seemed regretful about losing such a useful employee. He wanted to force Shirone to extend his contract using some unreasonable excuses, but Tamarin disagreed with this idea. Meanwhile, Shirone had read the last book he needed at the Grand Library, completing a year and a half of free reading of the Ojin family's collection. Ryan, who had been training with his sword, hurried over when he heard that Shirone had finished the book organization. He was worried that Shirone would leave without saying goodbye. Seeing that Shirone had read more than 800 books, Ryan looked even more excited than Shirone himself. To celebrate this moment, Shirone wanted to do something special and suggested, "Ryan, take me to tour your family's estate." Although they lived in the same estate, Ryan and Shirone mostly only met in the library, and it was usually Ryan who initiated their meetings since Shirone, being just a servant, had no chance to truly explore what it meant to live in a noble's home. Coincidentally, today the Ojin family had all gone out and would not return until the afternoon, so Ryan happily agreed to Shirone's request. Shirone had already seen the Grand Library, but stepping inside the mansion really took his breath away. Just one of the rooms felt as big as his entire house. Ryan was genuinely the young master of a wealthy family, yet he wasn't haughty at all. In fact, he seemed quite friendly. Ryan took Shirone to see his bedroom. It was the smallest room at the end of the hallway. Shirone braced himself, expecting to be dazzled by opulence. However, the truth was that Ryan's bedroom was much simpler than the others, and most importantly, it was filled with workout equipment and training swords. The messy bed looked like a resting spot after training rather than a lavish sleeping space. Shirone couldn't believe his eyes. A young master like Ryan lives in such a simple place. It was clear that you couldn't judge someone by appearances. After doing a full turn, Shirone and Ryan decided to play poker. However, Ryan kept complaining about losing the game. "Hey, you must be cheating with your little tricks, right?" "What? Do you think I'm someone who would stoop to such low tactics?" Then Shirone revealed how he figured out Ryan's cards. "That's how you win. You have a habit of placing your aces on the edges, and the way you bet when you have a pair is pretty obvious." Ryan felt called out and wanted to roll on the ground in frustration. "My observational skills come in handy as soon as you're not focused on any one thought. So when observing an opponent, you should pay attention to all their actions, and then you can guess what they're thinking." Shirone genuinely wanted to help Ryan improve and hoped he'd break through his limits soon. But unexpectedly, before he could finish his point, Ryan fell asleep. Shirone had intended to head back to his room for a rest when he suddenly heard a melodic voice. The melody, tone, and rhythm were all perfectly controlled by the musician. Shirone instinctively followed the sound. He knew that in this world, there was only one person who could play like this. "That's Ryan's sister, Raina Ojit. What do you think?" "That's my Samada." After the music stopped, Raina suddenly asked, which made Shirone, who was hiding behind the long door, jump in surprise. Seeing that she had noticed him, he decided not to hide anymore and walked directly in front of her, saying, "I thought it was really wonderful." Shirone's mood started to tense up again. It might have been because she was a noble girl, or maybe it was because Raina was just so beautiful. Raina continued, "Hello, this is the first time we've met. Are you new here?" Shirone quickly replied, "Yes, miss. I'm in charge of sorting books in the library, and I've been doing it for about a year now." Raya responded with an "oh," as she had heard of Shirone as a smart kid who could sort more than 10,000 books on his own. Raina then asked, "If that's the case, have you ever played the piano?" Shirone really wanted to decline because, besides Ryan, he didn't want to get involved with any other contestants. Moreover, Raina was known for her expertise in using charts during her performances, so he wanted to approach her. However, Ryan had once told him that he was the one with the worst personality in the mansion. Thus, when responding, Shirone seemed quite cautious. Shirone answered, "No, not yet, miss." Raina immediately suggested, "Then let me teach you. Come here." Raina moved to one side, leaving space on the seat for Shirone. But he really didn't dare to sit there. What's wrong with the Ojin siblings anyway? Shirone thought to herself, feeling that she could be careless. He was an expert in using a comb when performing. He awkwardly replied to her, "It's fine, right?" Even though he said it was fine, his heart was in turmoil. Ryan had also mentioned that the most difficult person in this mansion was his sister. She looked at him and smiled gently, "Then I'll teach you. Are you going to sit down here?" As she finished speaking, one hand rested on the piano keys while the other patted the space beside her. He was taken back by her invitation, sweat starting to form on his forehead. He felt increasingly tense, internally screaming, "What? Sit there?" Ryan noticed his anxious expression and calmly reassured him, "It's okay. I'm allowing it, so no one will blame you. He bit his lip, hesitating and fighting internally. He insists on this, and I don't have the right to refuse. With no choice, he reluctantly sat down, feeling both nervous and excited, his heart still in a frenzy. He reminded himself that he might not get another chance to sit in front of a piano. He sat seriously, listening as she introduced him to music theory. She eagerly guided him through each note. Now there were notes like do, re, mi, and musical symbols that were. She asked him to try pressing all 3 keys down at the same time. He quickly followed her instruction, gently pressing down with 3 fingers all at once. A sound rang out, leaving him a bit flustered. The clear, melodic tone stirred something in him. He sighed. This sound is really beautiful. She turned to him, surprised, and said, Great start. At that moment, he felt a mix of emotions that was hard to describe. He was embarrassed, and his eyes couldn't hide his awkwardness. He spoke up. I'm sorry if I'm asking too much, but may I try playing? She was taken aback by his suggestion, but didn't hesitate to agree. Sure. Shirone bowed his head, realizing that his request might have been a bit out of line. He felt that his proposal was perhaps a little too much, and he mumbled, Maybe it won't be very good. Raina smiled gently at him and replied, That's how everyone starts. However, deep inside her, a question lingered. Does he know more about music theory than what I've just taught him? Shirone placed his hands on the piano keys, carefully touching the notes. He began to move his fingers gently and gracefully, pressing the black and white keys. The clear and enchanting sound of the notes rang out one after another. Raina was so amazed that she covered her mouth, her eyes fixed on his hands. She was in awe, unable to believe that he was playing everything wrong, but there was no hesitation as she pressed a key herself. She wondered, should I stop him? Raina was sweating as she watched Shirone play the piano. A thought crossed her mind. She focused on the music he was creating, her expression softening. It was strange. He was completely off-key. Though the sounds weren't perfect and were a bit chaotic, she still enjoyed it. Then suddenly, Raina noticed something. Her eyes widened as she gazed at his hands, skillfully moving across the keys. She was stunned to realize that he was capturing the essence of the piece she had just played. In that moment, she understood that he could perfectly mimic the feelings of the music she had just performed. The harmony at each note left her amazed and speechless. His eyes suddenly sparkled with a jade light. Shirone felt like he had fallen into a matrix of musical notes. He and she sat at the center, with dim lights creating an otherworldly and captivating atmosphere. Under his skilled hands, melodies and sounds flowed seamlessly together. His fingers moved gracefully over the piano keys, and the notes seemed to dance around him with each tune. When Shirone pressed down, the keys sparkled, highlighting his elegance and finesse. At that moment, Raina furrowed her brows, her expression growing serious, as if he was on the right track. She paused, beginning to realize that he was becoming more accurate. His hands kept rising and falling, moving nonstop, much like a true artist. She sat focused, listening and savoring each melody he painted. Raina stared at the young man before her, struggling to believe what was unfolding. An indescribable feeling welled up inside her. It wasn't just a performance. He seemed to possess a deep insight, sensing the most exquisite nuances. Raina observed every gesture and action of Shirone, with questions bubbling up in her mind. How could this boy be a butler, especially when he looked so noble? He noticed her pensive demeanor and understood. I'm sorry, Before he could finish his sentence, a loud shout from Ryan broke through. Don't be so loud, you annoying little gremlin. The shout shattered the soft, flowing atmosphere, causing Shirone's mood to drop. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. Raina looked annoyed, her eyes showing a hint of anger. He stood in front of Raina's room, slipping his hand under his shirt to scratch lightly, revealing his toned six-pack. He continued shouting, Once we're home, just relax. Why do you have to act so crazy? Looking inside the room, he was stunned to see someone else besides her. He stared at the guy in surprise and confusion. Oh, you're here too, Shirone. Shirone found himself in an awkward situation with Raina. He felt a bit shy and embarrassed, responding clumsily, yeah, that's right. Raina, sitting beside him, looked puzzled and asked in disbelief, Do you two know each other? While Raina stood there bewildered, Shirone glanced between him and her, his expression flustered. He stammered, And no, actually. Unsure of how to answer her question, he started sweating nervously, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over him. He worried that his friendship with Raina would be exposed. Why did it feel like he was committing a crime? From behind, Raina casually scratched herself and said, Oh, Shirone. He just woke up completely now. His eyes lit up as he introduced Shirone to Raina. He's my friend. Shirone felt helpless and scared as he crouched down on the floor, his eyes wide with horror as he looked at Raina. What do you mean, Ryan? You know deep down how it is. You're probably afraid that if our friendship is exposed, it won't be pretty. He smiled brightly, hands on his hips, directing his attention toward Raina. Ryan reassured him, Don't worry, that gremlin witch is definitely different, but she doesn't care much about that stuff. Shirone's eyes widened in disbelief, turmoil churning inside him. What? How can that be? How can she not care? As he struggled to figure out how to face her, Reina spoke up first. So, your name is Shirone, huh? She squatted down beside him with a gentle and caring demeanor. She lightly placed her hand on his shoulder, saying, Don't worry, if Reina says you two are friends, that's good enough. The kid can be a bit annoying, but he takes responsibility for his words. Her unexpected demeanor took him by surprise and made him feel a bit anxious. Reina didn't care whether he and Ryan were friends or not, but what really piqued her curiosity was his thoughts. She asked, So, what were you thinking while playing the piano? I really want to know. His heart raced at her question, his mind filled with a flurry of question marks, unsure of what she was getting at. Ryan was also taken aback by her inquiry. What? Was Shirone playing the piano? I thought you were just being crazy in here. Witnessing this exchange, all of his beliefs from the past 16 years began to crumble. The walls of his understanding shattered in an instant. He couldn't help but wonder, does he really not care if I'm friends with a commoner? Shirone turned to him and said, Ryan, why are you lying? Your sister is a beautiful and kind lady. Hearing Shirone's words, Reina couldn't help but feel delighted. In contrast to her expression, Reina's face turned pale. Ryan seemed serious, fear glimmering in his eyes as he said, What? Don't let her fool you. She's a witch. Who knows when she'll latch on to you and swallow you whole? His words left Shirone stunned. She leaned in closer to him, covering her mouth with her hand and smiling apologetically. I'm sorry, my little brother can be a bit childish. I'm glad he has you as a friend. Please take care of him. He looked into Reina's smiling face and responded to her. It's no trouble at all. Honestly, I'm the one who owes you a favor. Her warmth made him feel shy. Reina couldn't stop praising Shirone. Oh my, you're so cute, she exclaimed. Hearing this, Reina smiled mischievously. If he's so adorable, why not keep him around? Maybe we should let him join our family too. Ryan was surprised by this suggestion from Reina, and her excitement was evident. Are you really that close to him? Aren't you worried he might steal your big sister away? Ryan chuckled at the thought. What are you talking about? I'm not the one you should be concerned about. It's Shirone you should worry about. As she finished speaking, Ryan grabbed Shirone's collar tightly. The two began to fight, and she didn't hold back, regardless of the fact that he was her brother. Do you think you were so tough just because I didn't say anything? They wrestled on the floor, and soon Ryan could take it no longer and cried out in pain. Ouch, that hurts. Shirone stood by, watching the two sisters. His mind was filled with confused thoughts, and he felt lost. Just when he thought he was starting to understand the nobility, it became even more perplexing. After they had fought enough, Ryan huffed in frustration and shouted at Reina. Why are you back home? You just took a break not long ago. She casually brushed off her hands, saying, Don't you know? Ray is getting ready for the exam. I'm here to pick him up. We'll be leaving tomorrow. He went to visit a friend. He'll be back later. Ryan gasped in surprise. What? Are you kidding? He lowered his head, his voice growing softer. So it's that far away. He noticed Ryan looking a bit down, and his mind kept racing with the things she had said. The exam was a critical test, a certification process that recognized mages and swordsmen, not just in the kingdom, but across the entire continent. Over 1,000 participants competed each year, but only about 30 succeeded each time. There were also unqualified credentials. Graduating from a recognized academy, like the Althea's Academy of Magic, offered the chance to become a level 10 unqualified mage. After achieving certain accomplishments through organizations and guilds, they could rank up. Hundreds, even thousands flocked there. The lines stretched far beyond what the eye could see, but wherever there was wealth and fame, people naturally gathered. Even after obtaining unqualified credentials, people continued to yearn for certified recognition. This legendary exam was what Ray was preparing for at the age of 18. Ryan admired him. Sure enough, geniuses are different. They have the full support of their families too. He let out a long sigh. Shirone's mood sank as Reina approached him, gently ruffling his hair in a comforting manner. It's all good. I'll go prepare dinner. It's seafood from the royal palace, so I have to do it myself, she reassured him. She turned to Shirone with a bright smile. It's so nice to meet you, Shirone. Let's meet again next time. He looked at her in a daze. Yes, I wish you a good day. He secretly thought, will I have another chance to see her? Remembering the moment earlier when she taught him how to play the instrument, he felt wonderful. He didn't know if he could meet her again since he would be leaving the estate tomorrow. Reina walked out, leaving Shirone and Ryan behind. He turned to her, hesitating. Don't say anything. Ryan, the lady's sister, looked at Shirone. Shirone gazed off into the distance, his expression determined. He asked Ryan, does she have a boyfriend? His question took Ryan by surprise, leaving her momentarily speechless. Seeing his expression, Shirone realized he might have overstepped. He quickly backtracked. It's nothing, really. Ryan couldn't contain her laughter, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Shirone quickly responded to her reaction. I was just curious. Forget I asked that. Before Shirone could finish her sentence, Ryan burst out the door, shouting, Hey, sister. Shirone sensed something was about to happen and called after him. I told you there's nothing wrong. Shirone gritted his teeth, his face anxious. As he saw Ryan about to run out the door, he quickly followed. A feeling of urgency filled his heart as he blamed himself for accidentally saying something that upset Ryan. Meanwhile, Ryan sprinted outside at full speed, not forgetting his mission as he yelled, Sister, Shirone wants to ask you something. Ryan stood on the upper floor, gripping the railing and leaning over to shout loudly. Do you have a boyfriend? Ryan was leading the maids to prepare a meal from the royal gate when Ryan's shout echoed throughout the hall. His words rang out again. Do you have a boyfriend yet? His question left everyone stunned, and they turned to stare at Ryan. Shirone rushed from behind, covering Ryan's mouth while pulling him back, leaving him to make mumbling noises. Upstairs, Shirone kept holding Ryan tightly and covering his mouth. The muffled sounds coming from him made the people below start whispering to each other. What? What's going on? A boyfriend? Inside, she felt her heart racing. Seeing the maids looking over, she could only smile awkwardly, trying to hide her embarrassment. She laughed and said to them, They're just joking around. Don't mind it. Reina and her attendants continued walking, and as she walked, she said, We've finished separating the poison now, need to heat it up. They all responded in unison, Yes, miss. Behind a nearby wall, the head butler had been standing there for a long time, observing everything that just happened. He called to someone behind him, Hannist, does the young master have any guests today? The person bowed his head and replied, No schedule arranged, sir. Upstairs, Ryan was about to say more when Shirone quickly grabbed his arm to stop him. The head butler coldly addressed his subordinate. I've heard that voice before, and now I remember. He turned his face, his eyes sharp as daggers. He ordered his follower, Get Timur into my office immediately. He furrowed his brow and shouted, Right now. The sky was clear, and the forest was covered by tall trees. The sound of Ryan's breathing and his training echoed in the air. A voice called out, Take a 10-minute break. Ryan, panting and out of breath, held a training staff in his left hand while wiping sweat from his face with his right. The teacher looked at Ryan and stroked his beard thoughtfully. He thought about Ryan, who had become more enthusiastic again. It had to be about a year now. Watching Ryan train with such passion, he recalled last time he gave up so quickly. He glanced at Ryan, deep in thought, but I'm sure that once we get to the royal palace, the boy will change. The key is to hold onto the map. Drops of sweat trickled down Ryan's face. Suddenly, a frantic voice called out, Young master. Ryan jumped, looking in the direction of the call. A man wearing a hat rushed over, visibly anxious. His voice carried from a distance. Young master, Miss Reina is requesting you to return to the mansion immediately. Ryan, about to take a sip of water, felt irritated by the man's words. My sister, huh? If it's just about praising my brother, I'm not interested. Just tell her to do whatever she wants. The servant quickly shook his head. No, it's not that, sir. The young lady said that Shirone is in danger. He might die. At this, Ryan spat out the water he had in his mouth. He stood up, holding the water bottle, looking at the servant with a mix of urgency and worry. Huh? Why? I thought he was coming home today. The servant, having run so fast, was now bent over, gasping for breath. The head butler reported to the family head. I'm not sure of the details, but the young lady said it has to do with you. Ryan hurriedly grabbed his coat and threw it on. He was anxious and turned to his teacher, saying, Master, I have to go meet my father. The old man saw Ryan's demeanor and knew something was wrong. He pressed, What's going on? Ryan, a bit flustered, replied, A butler named Shirone is my friend, and somehow my father found out. There's not much time. I feel like I'm sitting on a pile of fire. He said to the old man, I'm sure my father will forgive him if I can convince him. I'll train later. Before he could finish, the old man interjected, No way. Ryan stopped what he was doing, stood up straight, and looked at the old man in disbelief, asking, Why? The old man picked up a sword and stood in front of Ryan, causing him to exclaim, Master. Before them stood an impressive and grand mansion nestled at the foot of a mountain, vast and expansive. Inside the main hall of the mansion, Shirone knelt on the floor. Male and female servants lined up on either side near the throne. Sitting in the center was the head of the family, Ogden Bickhoff. On either side sat youngest Rena and young Master Rai, with the head butler behind them. Shirone knelt before them, feeling a mix of anxiety and dread. The powerful voice of the man echoed with authority. Arian Shirone. Bickhoff exuded an air of high nobility. He held a report in his hand and looked at Shirone with anger, saying, You will be executed. The entire mansion was thrown into an uproar as people whispered among themselves, shocked by the events. How could this happen? The maids were filled with worry and fear. One maid leaned in to whisper to another, "How can a commoner dare to do this to a noble?" The murmurs grew louder, with another voice chiming in, "Shirone must not know what he's doing. Even if he's clueless, he should understand these rules." Every judgment and piece of gossip was heard by Temuren, who simply glanced at the maids without saying a word. 3 people sat on a long bench. Bickhoff was intensely focused on the documents in his hands. Ray sat beside him, a bit arrogant and indifferent. Only Raina looked anxious, as if she were sitting on a bed of coals, wanting to speak to her father. Unable to hold back any longer, Raina spoke up, her tone filled with worry and urgency. "Dad, wait, I have something to say." Bickhoff flipped through the documents while asking her, what else could there possibly be to say? He examined the stack of papers carefully. The documents supplied by the head butler detailed a long list of staff lined up, all trembling in fear. Bickhoff was using this stack of documents to accuse Shirone, which included testimonies from many staff members confirming that the boy had behaved recklessly in front of Ryan. He turned to Raina and questioned her. "You've read the details of the contract, so you should have no objections. Is there anything else you want to say?" At that moment, Shirone lowered his head, hesitating a bit, but then his voice came out, "I want to ask something." He looked up at the man, his gaze cautious. "If I am friends with the young master, what will happen to him?" All the servants were utterly astonished, thinking that he was truly finished. Didn't he realize the gravity of his situation? He should have been begging for his life instead. The man was furious. "Do you dare to ask me that?" Raina glanced at her father and then at Shirone. In such a life-or-death situation, he still had the courage to ask about Ryan. She wondered to herself, is he worried about Ryan? Even in this dire circumstance, the man was enraged, hurling insults at Shirone. He really thought a commoner like him could befriend someone of noble standing without consequences. Shirone sighed, bowed his head, and then smiled. He looked directly at the man and clearly stated, "Yes, Ryan and I are friends." In front of everyone, he once again confessed, "We've been friends for a year now, and I want to make it clear that we will always be friends." The servants were terrified hearing these words from him. They fearfully exclaimed, "This person has gone mad." The man's eyes gleamed with a trace of killing intent, and the servants couldn't help but be curious. "Why aren't you scared at all?" he warned Shirone with a tone full of disdain. "That's right, it seems you look down on that guy, Ojin." Bickhoff lost his composure and shouted, "Head butler, deal with him quickly and make sure this doesn't leak out." He handed a stack of documents to the head butler. The butler bowed respectfully and took the stack from him. 2 soldiers stepped forward, each taking one of Shirone's arms to lead him outside for his punishment. Raina shouted to stop him, "Father, wait. Please listen to me." She bowed deeply, her face revealing her worry and fear for her increasingly volatile father. When he saw her trying to interfere with his decision, he turned his anger towards her. He admitted it, and I've made my decision as the head of the family. Once I decide something, it won't be reversed. The servants felt like they were sitting on hot coals, all fearing for their fragile lives. The blonde man felt it was unfair and turned to the head butler, "Isn't this a bit too much?" The chubby guy next to him also wouldn't back down and decided to speak up to protect himself. "It's not right for all of us to risk our lives for one person." The blonde guy's face darkened when he heard those words, and he glanced at his companion in fear. He frowned and complained, "This family is our lifeline. To protect it, we need to eliminate any conflict that arises, no matter how small." As Shirone was being taken away by the 2 of them, he watched and said something mysterious. "Right now, you might think it's wrong, but later you'll be grateful for this choice." Suddenly, the door swung open and a scream echoed throughout the mansion's grand hall. "I won't let that happen." Ryan burst in, looking urgent and flustered, with his mentor's sword still in his hand. Raina felt overwhelming joy, unable to hide her happiness on her face. "Finally, you're back." Her heart, which had been hanging in suspense, felt relieved. She called out, "Ryan." But contrary to her excitement, Bickhoff's expression darkened. He crossed his arms sternly, showing no hint of joy as he stared at his son. Shirone looked up at Ryan, but in Ryan's eyes there was not the anticipation that Raina had, but a resigned acceptance, as if he was waiting for the punishment he feared would fall on him. He probably worried about dragging Ryan into trouble. With a mix of impatience and anger, Ryan shouted wildly, "Who dares to kill my friend without my permission?" He coldly and decisively looked at the boy. With a calm demeanor, he said, "Oh, just a single phrase from him is enough to reveal his authority and status in his family." Ryan below used all of his words to defend Shirone. Ryan couldn't understand why, just for becoming friends with him, Shirone would face such a bitter end. Shirone was putting his life on the line for their friendship. Ryan questioned him. "Why? What did he do that was so wrong? He only made friends with me." Raina stood up anxiously, unable to hold back her worry for her brother and Shirone. He noticed that his son dared to question him over a commoner. He viewed human life as cheap. One didn't have to commit a grave mistake to deserve death. Matters involving nobility are very complicated. You can't even begin to imagine. Ryan regained his composure and shouted in anger. His words were strikingly firm. Our family is handling this complex situation, and I'm enjoying the privileges of being a noble son. If those privileges force me to kill my friend, then I don't need them. He looked at Ryan with an imposing glare, imposing his views on others. His words dripped with class distinction. Just a child. You wonder why he must die? Being friends with a noble means that relationship must be equal. Shirone was being escorted by 2 guards, his eyes indifferent, and his earlier bold declaration only fueled the man's irritation. Seeing Shirone, he hastily threw out insults and contempt. Do you really think that commoner considers you a friend? On what basis? There are countless people wanting to take advantage of the nobility. Ryan shouted back, vehemently opposing his father's arrogant words. Shirone would never do that. He looked at Ryan with disdain, his patience with Ryan waning. So what? Bickhoff stared at Ryan. His harsh words weighed on the boy's psyche. Why should I believe you? Prove that you and Shirone are truly friends. His words left Ryan stunned. Prove. Doubts crept into his heart. He felt uneasy. This was not good. Ryan, standing nearby, was also caught off guard by her father's question. She nervously looked toward him. He was staring intently at Ryan, a half-smile on his face, his eyes filled with arrogance. Ryan's mind was in chaos. If he said he couldn't prove anything, it would all be over. The pressure from the man's question weighed heavily on him. After hesitating for a moment, he finally said, "It's my feeling." He wondered if one could even prove human feelings. He found himself lost in tangled thoughts, but felt he could just speak recklessly. He tried to put himself in Shirone's shoes. If I were Shirone, I could easily take him down. Suddenly, an idea popped into his head. What if I were Shirone? He glanced at him and saw his carefree expression, completely relaxed and unafraid, yet his eyes were unwavering and strong. Looking into his eyes, Ryan fell into contemplation. Those eyes seemed to absorb everything around them, just like when they had competed before. Ryan stared deeply into those eyes as if Shirone was guiding him. He recalled Shirone's past words. Ryan, sometimes not focusing on the little things can yield better results. He remembered the time they had played cards together. When his cards didn't turn out as he hoped, Ryan rested his chin in his hands, feeling frustrated and unmotivated. In Shirone's hands, however, was a higher card. Shirone advised Ryan, don't focus on your opponent's minor details. Instead, look at the bigger picture. Ryan was skeptical of Shirone's words. Look at the bigger picture, huh? Shirone flipped over the card and held it out to Ryan. This way, you'll see their true intentions. He silently noted this in his mind. Ryan felt a surge of courage. Bigger picture, he murmured to himself. The person right in front of me, well, he's a minor noble, the head of the Ojin family, with black hair and a level 4 knight certified by a high official. He tightened his grip on the sword his master had given him, affirming in his heart, that's right, this isn't just an argument between a father and son. This is a duel. Flashback to 30 minutes earlier when he received the news and was preparing to leave, only to be stopped by his master. He shouted at him, Master, why won't you let me go? My friend could die. His master remained calm and unbothered by Ryan's urgency. Yes, you're talking about that kid who works in the library, right? Ryan hesitated and continued. But that kid is just a commoner. He was stunned into silence when he heard his master say that. Master, I didn't know you thought like that, he exclaimed. You've taught me better. I can't believe the person I've always respected could have such narrow-minded and outdated views just like my father. At that moment, Ryan felt completely broken. He lost control and shouted out his feelings, saying, if wielding a sword could mean having a conversation, then anyone could be my friend. His teacher calmly looked at his troubled student, beginning to explain. Ryan, don't you know what's most important for a noble? Isn't it true that a noble must eliminate anything that threatens their family's status? The teacher went on to outline the risks for Ryan's family. Have you ever thought about the burden your friend carries when his worth is equal to that of a fly? Have you considered the consequences of becoming friends with him without thinking it through? Hearing these words, Ryan clenched his teeth, feeling choked up. His shoulders shook repeatedly, unable to hold back the tears that streamed down his cheeks. Each drop of water seemed to highlight his helplessness and emotional pain. The teacher advised Ryan, his voice warm but firm, don't even think about resolving this with arguments. Ryan clenched his fists tightly, his fingers curling with determination. He spoke to the teacher with a tone filled with resolve, yet also revealing his frustration. But I can't just stand here and do nothing. I was the one who suggested we be friends. Ryan raised his hand, his eyes blazing with fierce determination as he spoke louder. I don't want to be a coward. His words felt like a challenge against adversity, and his determination shone through every gesture and look. Ryan looked at him with a different gaze. The old man silently appreciated him, recognizing his determination. The boy was very caring, honest, and pure. But that won't make you a great swordsman. I have high hopes for you, and I will support you. He held his sword out in front of Ryan and handed it to him. Take it. Fortunately, the old man was not the type to be narrow-minded or classist. He also advised and warned Ryan, I'll let you go if you bring this back with you. But if you're not even ready for what this means, don't think about stepping out of here. Ryan took the sword from his master, his eyes fixed on it. His gaze reflected his determination and seriousness. Right now, Ryan had to make a choice that aligned with his beliefs. His eyes lit up, carrying an unwavering confidence and resolve. Master, I will never forget this kindness. Every word he spoke felt like a vow, etched deep into his heart and mind, becoming the motivation for him to move forward and face this challenge. The old man glanced at him, remembering that letting go of a friend was like losing a part of oneself. His words served as a reminder and a warning. Inside, Ryan felt a raging storm. This was a duel, fought with his life on the line. Returning to the present, in front of the mansion, Ryan realized the truth his master had taught him. With his sword in hand, he threw back his head and laughed. His laughter echoed throughout the mansion, sending shivers down the spines of those who heard it. Just like Dad, I nearly let myself be defeated. You shouted in anger, saying, Are we friends? I believe we are because I believe that I am Shirone's friend. You added that your existence as Shirone's friend was proof of the friendship between you and him. Bickoff was furious at these strong rebuttals. He gritted his teeth and hissed. This is absurd. This isn't a father-son debate. He yelled in rage. Even now, the reputation of countless families is crumbling. His words left the servants completely stunned. He continued his mad rant. If it means saving the family's reputation, I would even be willing to sever ties with my own son. His declaration shocked you and a group of maids. Raina had to scream, wow. You straighten your legs, adopting a serious stance, your voice firm and resolute, showing no hesitation. If I have to do that to save my friend's life. He bowed slightly, placing his right hand over his chest, and showed the most serious and respectful attitude possible to express his stance, ready to leave peacefully. Everyone around him was terrified by his action. Bickoff, enraged, shot up from his seat, fists clenched tightly, veins bulging visibly. He yelled at him, Kid, raise your sword. If you really think this kid is your friend, then bet your life on it right here. Without a moment's hesitation, he drew his sword. The sharp sound of the blade echoed, signaling that the bond between father and son was about to break. Bickoff couldn't believe his eyes. His son was actually drawing his sword to fight him over a commoner. He looked at him, voice faltering and halting. You're actually raising your sword to go against me. He held the sword in front of him. The blade pointed upwards, his gaze fierce and determined. I'm not pointing my sword at you, father. I'm just showing my trust. At that moment, Bickoff clutched his chest, trying to appear helpless. How can you have friends? You can't even get along with the other families. Maybe it's because you can't measure up to the nobles. Now you're just holding on to someone weaker to comfort yourself. But no, he lowered his voice, firm and resolute. This time, you're wrong, father. His eyes burned with intensity, steady and unshakable. They reflected both confidence and belief in himself. He lowered the sword and gun, speaking to the man with determination. Shirone is my friend, and he's better than I am. I want to help Shirone shine brightly in a higher position. Your decisiveness should leave Shirone in awe. Bickoff, embarrassed by his anger, pointed at Shirone, his voice filled with fury as he questioned, Did you deceive the boy? Did you convince him that a commoner could be friends with a noble? His words felt like a sharp knife piercing Shirone's self-esteem. Shirone quickly denied it. No, that's not true. Ryan stepped in front of Shirone, his voice protective and caring. Shirone, just stay there. I'll protect you. Shirone knew this was a decisive moment, not just for him, but also for the friendship he cherished. He called out Ryan's name. Ryan. Hearing Shirone call his name, Ryan froze. He took the blame entirely upon himself. You don't have to take responsibility for everything. I'll take responsibility for my part. Ryan turned to look at Shirone in shock. Shirone recalled the moment when Ryan's hand reached out to take his. From the moment you wanted to be my friend, I had a feeling that I would have to stand at a crossroads, choosing between being your friend and saving my own life. Ryan's eyes were filled with gratitude. Shirone looked at him and said, Even if it means I have to die here, I won't regret becoming your friend. Ryan lowered his head, tears welling up in his eyes. Shirone's sincere friendship didn't disappoint him at all. His voice was choked with emotion as he replied, That's right. Suddenly, Ryan lifted his face and shouted toward Bickoff, That's exactly what I mean. The words echoed like a powerful affirmation of their friendship and Ryan's unshakable determination. His heart was filled with faith and resolve, knowing he had made the right decision. Ryan shouted again to reaffirm his bond with Shirone. Even if I'm isolated, we are still friends. His strong, decisive words left Bickoff speechless, just staring in disbelief. Raina stood nearby, also moved to tears by his heartfelt statement. She thought, even if we lack maturity, we are still emotional beings. A true friend doesn't turn their back on us. The servants were touched as well, all of them shedding tears. Everyone has a friend like that. Those barriers made them lose their sense of equality and their dignity as individuals. The head butler glanced over at Ryan and Shirone, frowning slightly before clicking his tongue. Suddenly, a hearty laugh echoed throughout the mansion. How interesting. Everyone below looked up in surprise. Raita joyfully called out, "Grandfather." He stood on the upper level, looking down at everyone, full of vitality and excitement as he praised, "I never thought I would witness such a touching scene at my age. Youth truly is wonderful." Raita felt immense relief. Everything would be all right now. If her grandfather was involved, she believed the situation could be handled more easily. However, in contrast to her cheerful attitude, Bickhoff looked a bit uneasy. He glanced at his father with a puzzled expression and said, "You're here already? Raina told me you wouldn't be back for a few more days." He continued, "I arrived early because my friend ran away with a young woman." After saying that, he sat down in a chair. Shirome was taken aback by his appearance, staring at him as his mind subconsciously recognized the man's identity. He was the general of Thormia and a level 3 swordsman, Ryan's grandfather. He sat comfortably with his legs crossed, speaking with enthusiasm. "Anyway, this place is still as lively as ever. Youth truly is amazing." He was the former family head, Clump Ogent. While he was laughing and chatting with everyone, the current head of the family, his son, seemed far from cheerful. He looked troubled as he spoke to his father. "This situation isn't great at all. Our family's reputation has completely crumbled." His father didn't pay much attention to his son's gloomy demeanor. Instead, he eagerly turned his gaze toward the people in the grand hall. "Let's not rush to conclusions. I've been watching from behind and have seen quite a bit. Clearly, there are many things everyone wants to discuss. So why don't we first hear each other's opinions on whether we've truly lost face?" He welcomed the first speaker, his eldest daughter. She beamed with excitement as she shared her thoughts on Shirone. "Although yesterday was the first time I met Shirone, I could already tell he is a very intelligent and talented young man." She stood up to present like a speaker, and everyone there focused their attention on her, listening intently to her evaluation of Shirone. He crossed his legs and propped his chin on his hand, looking forward to hearing what his grandmother had to say. Moreover, Shirone has met all the requirements in the contract and was supposed to leave the family today. Given the circumstances, it's hard to say that Shirone approached Ryan with any ill intentions, and the conclusion was, "I don't believe his actions have tarnished the family's honor." He stroked his chin as if he understood what she meant. He scoffed coldly, "So that's it. If that's the case, what do you think, my second grandson?" The next person to share his thoughts was witness number 2, the second son, Rai Ogent. Though he hadn't spoken up before, his expression clearly showed no goodwill towards Shirone. He frowned and hissed through clenched teeth, "I don't like that kid." Behoff next to him was very pleased with this response. He smiled with satisfaction, silently praising his second son. "That's right. I knew I could trust you, Ray." However, Ray had never cared about things that didn't concern him, but this matter had nothing to do with him at all. His remark surprised Bickhoff, leaving him a bit taken aback. He exclaimed, "What do you mean?" Bickhoff's face turned dark as he turned to his son, who had always been indecisive, blaming him with a hint of reproach in his voice. "What do you mean by that? You said you don't like him and now you say it doesn't concern you." Ray crossed his arms over his chest, leaned back in his chair, eyes slightly closed, and spoke with an indifferent tone. "That's right. I don't like that kid, but who he hangs out with has nothing to do with me at all." He was blunt as he added, "I just want this to end so we can set off to the royal palace." Raina was taken aback by Ray's attitude. Her eyes lit up with admiration. "Oh, what an attitude you have, little brother." Clump laughed heartily at his nephew's comment. This was exactly why there was no place like home. He stroked his chin and looked at Ryan, eager to hear the opinion of someone who had surely observed the Shirone boy the longest. He called for the next person, the deputy steward. The next witness was Deputy Steward Temeran. He cleared his throat, but then his attention shifted to the head steward. The head steward raised his hand near his chin, signaling to him, thinking, I'm sure he's aware. Looking at Bickhoff's demeanor, the way he glanced at the deputy steward made his thoughts clear, signaling what was on his mind. We are not people who express our opinions, but rather those who obey the wishes of our master. Finally, the deputy steward managed to say the name, Shirone. He glanced at the head steward and expressed his genuine thoughts about Shirone. He has completed every task I assigned to him, and he did it exceptionally well. Moreover, he finished the work 6 months ahead of schedule. His words struck the head steward like a bolt from the blue. He never expected the deputy steward would go against his directive. He gritted his teeth, saying, what the hell does he think he's doing? Bickhoff sat back with a sigh, his earlier imposing demeanor fading away. Clump glanced at the butler and asked, do you know they're friends? The butler raised his hand to his chest respectfully and replied, I know he often goes out with the young master, but I didn't realize they were friends. However, from my perspective, if he were an unruly child, he wouldn't be able to categorize those 10,000 books. Shirone was taken aback, unable to believe what he was hearing. He never expected that, apart from Ryan, his friend, and the kind Lady Reyna, there would be someone else in the mansion standing up for him. It was the butler who spoke well of him. Reyna glanced at Shirone with a smile. Finally, someone is here to acknowledge Shirone's efforts and abilities. Raya rested her chin on her hand, secretly feeling happy for Shirone. Things have completely changed now. But her joy was quickly extinguished when she looked at her father. His gaze on Shirone remained unchanged, a frown of displeasure on his face as person after person defended Shirone. Most importantly, since Clump's return, everything was spiraling out of his control. She knew that her father was the only one who wanted to punish Shirone. Suddenly, a deep, commanding voice broke the tension. No. Clump stood up, resolute in his stance. I cannot agree to this. As soon as he finished speaking, both Reyna and Mr. Bickhoff chimed in at the same time. Dad, Grandpa. Reyna didn't understand why her grandfather changed his mind at the last minute. Just when she had managed to relax, she now felt like an ant on a hot pan, while he seemed more radiant than ever. Mr. Clump quickly corrected his earlier statement. No, I understand that you two see each other as friends. Shirone and Ryan stood before their grandfather, filled with worry and tension. He looked at them thoughtfully and said, However, let's stop here. If this relationship continues, rumors will eventually spread. This could become a vulnerability for our family, which our political opponents could exploit against us. He listened intently to his father's words, all too aware of the concerns Mr. Clump expressed. Rai, sitting beside him, still seemed indifferent. With a nonchalant attitude, Clump shared his perspective. Everyone in my family is a prominent member of the kingdom. Rai is either preparing to take an exam for certification. Besides, what else can I do when so many families depend on me? The maids, standing straight, listened to his words and couldn't help but worry for their own futures and that of their families. Being commoners working for the nobility was already a privilege in itself. Shirone, you're a smart child. I believe you will understand. Rayna turned to look at her grandfather, wanting to say something, but the words caught in her throat. But Ryan couldn't stay still any longer. He gritted his teeth, staring intently at his grandfather with a determined look in his eyes that showed he wouldn't be bound by anyone's expectations. Clump found it both amusing and frustrating as he looked at his beloved grandson. He couldn't help but think, I see a lot of potential in you, Ryan. You're quite clever, but why would you understand what I'm trying to say? His own feelings were just as tangled. He wanted Rian to understand the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The burden of so many lives resting on him was a heavy one. At that moment, Clump turned to Shirone, eager to know his thoughts. He also wondered what Ryan had realized about himself after making friends with Shirone. What do you think, Shirone? I want to thank you for teaching my knave grandson what true friendship means. Clump didn't want their family to be judged because of Shirone. He asked, but can we end it here? Shirone only bowed his head. He closed his eyes for a moment before abruptly saying, no way. This stunned both Clump and Ryan. Mr. Bickhoff was equally surprised that Shirone would be so stubborn, not recognizing the seriousness of the situation. Rai, who usually didn't care about anything, now looked at Shirone differently. Ryan was equally taken aback by Shirone's response. He had thought Shirone would beg for mercy for his own life and sever their friendship. Ryan never expected Shirone to be so daring. Hesitantly, he wanted to call out Shirone's name. You looked at Shirone with sincerity, staring straight into his eyes, unable to hold back as you called out his name. Shirone. Shirone placed his hand on his chest, looked at you, and spoke words that came from deep within his heart. If I'm a burden to Ryan, I wouldn't mind never seeing him again. However, he was no longer hesitant or fearful. He boldly expressed his feelings. That doesn't mean I can't consider him a friend. He stated this confidently and firmly. Ryan and I are friends. I won't let anyone else tie our friendship down or let it be tainted by what someone else says. Shirone told Mr. Clump, as long as you think about these things, I will follow any orders you give me. Ryan's hand, which clutched his sword, shook uncontrollably, and he felt a wave of shame wash over him. Tears fell again, and deep down, he was blaming himself. I actually feel relieved that Shirone isn't dead. To be honest, a part of him truly felt that way. But Shirone understood that abandoning a friend was like giving up a part of himself. Ryan stared wide-eyed at Shirone. The lessons his master taught him during training were difficult to process, and he struggled to make a decision. For Shirone, he would rather lose his own life than sacrifice the bond of friendship. He felt a deep sense of shame. He made a firm resolution. Fine, this isn't something to negotiate. Ryan pointed his sword straight up to the sky and shouted loudly and decisively. His voice thundered. Here, I declare. Mr. Clump and Reyna immediately felt fear at Ryan's next actions. She shouted, "Don't do this. I don't know what you're planning, but please don't." She reacted this way because she wasn't sure if her younger brother was making a wise decision. Any small mistake could significantly impact his fate and that of their family. She couldn't let him act impulsively. Ryan drove the sword deep into the ground, the sound echoing painfully in everyone's ears. He knelt down, pushing the sword deeper into the stone floor, leaving Shirone astonished. He boldly declared in front of everyone, "I, Ryan Ogent, the third son of the Ogent family, from this moment on will become the sword of Shiro." His oath resonated like thunder in the tense, suffocating atmosphere, causing Ryan's father to tremble with rage. He grit his teeth, his face contorted in anger. He bellowed, "What is this, you damn fool?" The entire mansion seemed to shake under the force of his fury. His roar echoed through every corner. "You idiot." The origins of the Knight's Oath date back to when the Kingdom of Formia was established during a chaotic time when all nations, big and small, fought for territory. The strongest among them succeeded in uniting everyone and proclaimed the establishment of the Kingdom of Formia. However, the newly formed kingdom had to face powerful neighboring nations. Therefore, instead of being destroyed in the unification process, the defeated kings were allowed to rule their own territories directly. In this way, they created the Knight's Oath. The defeated kings had to kneel before the new king. They vowed to become the sword that only their master could wield in exchange for being granted noble status. This was the origin of the Knight's Oath and the birth of the nobility. Breaking the Knight's Oath meant becoming more contemptible than a rabid dog. Ryan turned to look at everyone and grinned mischievously. "What do you all think? I can't back out now, can I?" Everyone went silent, their mouths agape at this surprising decision. He still held tightly to the sword, one foot on the ground and one knee on the floor. Inside, he couldn't help but blame himself, thinking, "Master, it seems I've really messed up this time." Ryan also envisioned his master getting angry and scolding him. "I didn't give you the sword to do this." Shiro knelt beside him, grasping Ryan's hand with fear in his eyes. "Ryan, what the hell are you doing?" Ryan didn't respond, but glanced over at the others. Mr. Clump's voice rang out, his face stern and determined. "Ryan, if I'm really witnessing you say you'll become his sword, then that boy must be worthy, right? Answer me." Shirone helped Ryan to his feet, and they both looked towards Clump. He continued to ask, "Is he really that talented? Or is he just talented in your eyes because you see yourself as useless?" Hearing this, Ryan relaxed a little. A confident smile spread across his face as he placed a hand on his chest and shouted, "A sword isn't meant to be judged, it's meant to protect." Everyone fell silent at his response, and even Shirome looked taken aback. Suddenly, a hearty laugh broke through the tense atmosphere. Clump placed a hand on his face and laughed so joyfully that his body shook with it. He had to agree with Ryan's words. That's right. These immature kids at least need to rise to this level if they want to reach the peak. While Ryan's father sighed in exasperation, Ryan's grandfather couldn't help but praise him. "Your words are pretty impressive, but with your mediocre swordsmanship, I feel sorry for your friend who has to put up with such a weapon." Ryan couldn't believe what he was hearing from his grandfather. He could only stammer, "Grandpa, is that you?" Clump placed a hand on Shirone's shoulder. He smiled, comforting and reminding him, "That's enough, that's enough. Even if he's not the sharpest sword yet, Shirone, he will never betray you. Take good care of my grandson." Clump patted Shirone on the back. Shirone closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of this moment. He looked at Clump with gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you for recognizing me." He pointed towards the head butler and ordered him, "You two have sworn to be friends for life, so I can't let you leave like this." The head butler used the carriage that Shirone was supposed to take to go home and quickly took off to bring Shirone's parents here. He promptly acknowledged Clump's command. Yes, I'll go right now." The two servants exchanged amused glances and put their hats on. The head butler was still in shock, internally shouting, "Is this for real?" Looking up at the clear sky, light clouds floated gently by. He felt helpless, thinking, "I can never figure out what the nobility is really thinking." Ryan finally relaxed, smiling comfortably and exclaiming, "This is amazing." He flopped onto the bed, stretching his arms out. Shirone sat down next to him. Ryan laughed and asked, "Did you see the expressions on my family's faces? Absolutely wonderful." Shirone felt a twinge of guilt. "Ryan, you don't need to do this for me." Ryan sat up suddenly, startling Shirone. "Shirone, I'm not doing this because you're my friend." Ryan looked straight into Shirone's eyes, determination burning in his gaze. "I'm different from my brother. You have the power to inspire others. I'm just simply choosing to bet my life on someone like you." He felt a bit shy and blushed. "What?" He thought to himself, wondering why she suddenly brought that up again. Shirone looked at him and sighed, "I feel so much pressure." She blushed and said to Ryan, "But if you want to protect me, you'll have to train a lot harder." Her words made Ryan so angry he felt like he could spit blood. Seeing this, Shirone was concerned and asked, "What's wrong?" Ryan slumped down and said, "It's nothing. You just hit a sore spot in my heart." Suddenly, Raina burst through the door. She called out, "Ryan, did you really swear the knight's oath to become Shirone's sword?" As she walked in, she noticed Ryan collapsed in a pool of blood. She asked, "What happened to him?" Ryan mustered the last bit of his strength and said, "Get out." Shirone wouldn't budge. "What are you talking about? Just a little while ago, your sister helped us a lot." Shirone invited Raina in, saying, "Please come in." With pride, she replied, "That's right. I've brought important information from the opposing side." Ryan snapped into focus, his heart filled with a bit of worry. What's going on? What are father and grandfather doing? She gently sat down on the bed and explained to them. They really are bloodthirsty. But considering I brought up the knight's oath, they are planning their next moves. So anyway, she told them some very important news. Dad is considering enrolling you and Shirone in the Swordsmanship Academy. Shirone, you said your swordsmanship talent is incredible, didn't you? That's what you said. Shirone looked confused. But is it to that extent? She smiled. Of course. Now that you're a member of the family, I've told everyone about your talent to see if they would be willing to invest something in you. They want Shirone's talent to help Ryan. I'm sure for Ryan's future, they want to help you succeed. After hearing this, he shouted at her, "Not without my permission. Who dares to send me to school? I finally get to hang out with Shirone whenever I want." Without saying another word, she kicked Ryan to the ground and stepped on him. She sighed and yelled at Ryan without any mercy. This clueless brat is causing so much trouble and still wants to do more. Ryan protested loudly. He turned back and shot her a fierce look. Ryan yelled at her, and anyway, Shirone isn't even going to the Swordsmanship Academy. Shirone's future is as a mage. He's already unlocked his domain. She looked at Shirone in disbelief. What? His domain? Shirone has unlocked it. Wait, does that mean you have a knight's oath with a future mage? She looked at Shirone, her expression filled with skepticism, as if she couldn't believe her ears. Ryan, furious, shouted, "There's a limit to being useless. Get out of here, old lady." Thinking about the scene where Shirone and Ryan were sword fighting, Raina chimed in, "So you're using synesthesia to sense the spiritual world and read Ryan's movements to win." She rubbed her chin, impressed. "That sounds pretty clever. Since your energy in the spiritual world is quite high, that should definitely be possible." Shirone awkwardly replied, "Really?" Raina praised her nonstop. "You're amazing. From what I learned in school, the denser the energy, the more stable the spiritual world is. Being able to maintain that density while using a sword is incredibly impressive." Hearing those words, Shirone blushed and gently rubbed her head. Raina and Ryan shared the same thought. "Is that really embarrassing?" Raina said, "I'll talk to my grandfather about Shirone's path. Of course, to enroll in the swordsmanship school, that condition will come along too." Ryan, taken aback, exclaimed, "What? What will happen to your master then?" Ryan replied, "He already knows about this. That's why he ended the contract yesterday. Tomorrow morning, he'll be saying goodbye." Ryan was even more shocked. "Ah!" He tightly gripped his sword, feeling a wave of sadness wash over him. Ryan quietly thought of his master, the man who was about to leave this place forever. A butler entered and announced, "Sir, Shirone's family has arrived and is waiting in the living room. The master says you can go meet them first if you'd like." Ryan gently turned to ask Shirone what he thought. "What do you want to do?" At first, he just smiled, but soon he couldn't hide his emotions any longer. Overwhelmed with happiness, he jumped up and exclaimed, "I'm going." Shirone dashed down the stairs, making the two butlers worry. "Be careful on the stairs." Feeling a bit awkward, he said, "Just talk to me like you always do." But they panicked and replied quickly, "Oh no, please don't say that. We'll be lost." He smiled to reassure them, "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone." Still, they insisted, "Even so, you can't say that." After a few brief moments, they all arrived at the door to the living room. Shirone eagerly swung the door open to see the people he loved most inside. Upon seeing them, he shouted, "Mom, Dad." They were equally emotional, calling out his name in unison, Chiron. He disregarded everything else and rushed in like a small bird returning to its nest, finally burying himself in the warmth of his parents' embrace. The three of them held each other tightly, overwhelmed with the joy that filled the room. Shirone looked at his family, feeling a deep sadness in his heart. They had lost weight. They must have been struggling so much, worrying about him day after day. His mother was crying as she tried to reassure him. "Don't worry, we're doing just fine," she said. Vincent, his father, asked, "But why did you suddenly call us? If you're done with your work, you should come home." He suddenly became agitated and pressed him. "They didn't force you to stay, did they?" Shirone explained, "No, it's not like that. I just found a pretty good opportunity." His father didn't understand. His mother looked confused too. "A good opportunity?" Vincent replied. "Oh." Then Shirone quickly recounted everything that had happened to his family. After hearing it, they all sat there in shock, their faces blank, unsure of what to say. Vincent's eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at his son. Then he forced a smile and spoke. So you're saying you become friends with a young nobleman while working at the library, and that nobleman has pledged his knighthood to you and allowed you to be friends with him? Shirone replied casually, yes, that's right. Vincent's voice turned serious. Shirone, tell me the truth. He grabbed Shirone's shoulders and shook him, tears welling up in his eyes as he shouted, how can someone as smart as you have such delusions? Someone treated you badly, didn't they? Didn't they? Shirone felt like he was being shaken up to the sky, but managed to say, no, it's real. He tightly embraced his beloved child, crying loudly as if he were about to say goodbye forever. Oh my God, they say that those who visit noble houses cannot return unscathed. His wife, Shirone's mother, pleaded as she tried to pull him away. Vincent. Suddenly, the door opened again and the butler announced, young master, the head of the house has arrived. At that moment, 3 people entered. Bickhoff spoke first. It's a pleasure to meet you both. I am the head of this house. Bickhoff. Ryan gently bowed and said, hello, I am Shirone's sword. Raina introduced herself with a warm smile. I am the eldest daughter, Raina. I've heard so much about the two of you. The couple witnessed the shocking event in front of them, and their faces went pale. They quickly bowed respectfully and responded, greetings. We are Shirone's parents. Why would such remarkable people as yourselves? Raina, surprised by their ignorance, explained, oh my, you haven't heard from Shirone? Vincent, looking bewildered, asked with a trembling voice, are all those things the boy said really true? Even at the luxury banquet with all the delicious, expensive food, he still didn't believe it. No way, no way. In the end, Vincent seemed lost in thought, while Shirone's mother felt flustered, saying, honey, there are 2 ink plates. After finishing the meal, he still seemed like a person dropped from the sky, his mind swirling with confusion, wondering, what the hell is going on here? On the other side, she had just received a warm cup of tea and expressed her gratitude, saying, thank you. Vincent felt the heavy atmosphere in the room as if his mind was about to scream. What was happening? His hand trembled with the teacup, threatening to drop it at any moment. Even if he didn't know what the knight's oath was, there was no way they would treat a peasant family kindly like this. He needed to get to the bottom of this. With that thought, Vincent spoke up, excuse me, I'm glad my son is appreciated by you, but I have to express my concern. It's hard to believe that a noble hair like Ogent would take a knight's oath. Bickhoff frowned and replied, yes, honestly, I am also a bit uncomfortable with it. He continued, however, for the Ogent family, our militant ideals are absolute. If we discriminate simply because of social status, we tarnish Raina's honor. So from now on, we will use respectful forms of address. Please don't feel uneasy. My family will fully support your son. Clump laughed loudly and said, it's been a while since I heard you say something right. Bickhoff snapped irritably, father, keep it down. Shirone thought to herself, as the head of the family who manages and makes all the big decisions, his assertive and proud words truly suit him. Although he was only having difficulty deciding to place a civilian under his protection, Shirone subtly turned to Raina and noticed her winking at him. He continued to think as he saw Ryan's bright smile, but he wasn't afraid of anyone. Bickhoff then returned to his serious expression and said, to get straight to the point, I must say your son is a user of the spiritual world. The spiritual world isn't something you can just access through hard work. To put it plainly, it's a true talent that one is born with. He continued, from what I know, he aims to become a wizard. If he wants to obtain an unofficial wizard certificate as quickly as possible, I believe the Alphea's Magic Academy, one of the 5 most prestigious schools in the country, would be suitable for him. Bickhoff rubbed his chin and added, I'm not saying he can only become a wizard by attending that school, but if he doesn't pursue that route, it would be a waste of his talent, and I wouldn't encourage that. So he should go to Alfie's Academy to align with the standards of the Ogent family. Clump reminded, consider their understanding, my son. He looked at Vincent's stiff expression and immediately understood what his father meant. Then Bickhoff got straight to the point. If your son graduates from the magic school, he will become a wizard. At that moment, he finally understood it and jumped to his feet. Our son will become a wizard. Vincent thought to himself, the Wizard Academy. He began to stutter. No way, this must be a dream, right? Our son. Bickhoff continued, however, the biggest issue is his background. Vincent was startled when he heard the man explain that the magic school was selective, only allowing noble hairs to enroll. Clump added, there's only one choice. Then he seriously stated, we will adopt Shirone into the Ogent family. Vincent couldn't believe what he had just heard. He stood there in shock, his mind in chaos. What? Clump was determined to present his plan. This is the only option after we've merged our families. He pushed forward a document. I have a cousin who still doesn't have any children. If I add the boy's name to my cousin's family, all issues will be resolved. However, we have no intention of taking your child away. This is just on paper. But through this, Shirone will become a noble. Vincent thought, Shirone will become a noble. How lucky he is to have such an opportunity. But if I agree to this, it feels like this child is being taken away from me. He gave his son an anxious look, silently pleading, tell me, Shirone, what should I do? Seeing Shirone's calm expression made him even more frightened. Could it be that he has already made up his mind? At that moment, Shirone glanced at his father, slowly resting his hand on his father's large, weathered hand that had endured so much for him, then squeezed it tightly, causing Vincent some pain. With a determined look, Shirone firmly rejected, no way. I am my father's son, and I cannot become someone else's adopted child. Hearing this, his father cried out in alarm, Shirone. Raina, sitting across from them, explained, this is just on paper. Of course, we will still treat your parents as your real parents. You will achieve your dreams, and nothing will change. As she finished speaking, Clumph chimed in, you will become a noble. Opportunities like this don't come around often. Still resolute, Shirone responded, if I have to change fathers, I'd rather live as a commoner. Clumph angrily shouted, commoners can't enroll in the magical school. Shirone firmly replied that I won't go to school. Once again, his father struck at his emotions. Then you won't become a mage. Big Hoff and Ryan were both astonished. Once again, he insisted that I won't become a wizard. His words left Shirone's mother and Ryan stunned. Clumph grew more agitated and shouted, Shirone, why are you being so stubborn? This world isn't easy. There are things you have to let go of to succeed. If you can't do that, then your dream is just child's play, isn't it? He replied casually, maybe that's true. The response shocked Clumph to the core. What? Over by Vincent, tears welled up in his eyes, which usually sparkled with enthusiasm and energy. The look of confusion and sadness was clear on his face. Shirone spoke up, no matter how wonderful my dream is, it comes from my parents. If they are the roots, then my dream is the fruit that draws its nutrients from them. He remembered the past, filled with memories of standing side by side with his family. Learning to read and having the chance to work at the Ojin house were things he achieved because of his parents. This was just an opportunity he had received, nothing compared to the countless opportunities his parents had given him. Shirone chuckled and stated firmly, now telling me to abandon my roots is like asking me to die. I really appreciate everyone's suggestions, but they are my only parents. At his words, everyone in the room fell silent, unable to say a single word to one another. Clumph was so shocked that his eyes widened in disbelief. Deep down, he thought, what is this feeling of guilt? No, what the child means is... Suddenly, Vincent bent down and spoke loudly, please accept Shirone as your adopted child. I beg you. Shirone looked a bit confused. Dad. Clumph replied from a distance, I understand what you're saying, but Shirone's concerns. He ignored the others around him, struggling to say, Shirone is not my biological son. Shirone's mother gasped at her husband's words. Vincent, what are you saying? He continued to look down as he replied, we cannot have children. Their child added, we got Shirone to do an unexpected event. I'm sure you can see it, but it's clear he comes from a noble family. The boy is extraordinary. Both Clumph and Raina were increasingly stunned by this revelation. Vincent kept sharing his thoughts. If he becomes the adopted child of a noble family, he will return to where he truly belongs. So this isn't about a father disowning his son or denying his roots. Beowulf thought to himself, is that really the case? He looked at their family and understood. Everyone here has probably guessed that Shirone looks nothing like his parents. He then rubbed his chin in contemplation, thinking, what does that mean he wants to give up his son? Shirone could take no more. He was extremely agitated and grabbed his father's arm, shouting, Dad, what are you doing? How can you say that without telling me first? At that moment, Vincent could only avoid his son's gaze. I'm sorry, but you're old enough to know the truth. Suddenly, Shirone asked seriously, did you really think I didn't know? Vincent was taken aback by those words. Shirone's mood had sunk heavily and he struggled to say, the reason I didn't ask you, Dad, is because people only have one dad and one mom. I want that too. But now, you want me to have 6 parents. Vincent was taken aback, fear and heartache filling him as he hesitantly replied, I don't want you to give up on your dreams because of me. Tears began to fall from his eyes. Shirone shouted decisively, who's giving up on their dreams? As long as I try, opportunities will come. But he cried heartbrokenly as he looked at his father and asked, have you ever thought about how I feel? Who wants to be abandoned by their parents twice? Vincent tightly grasped Shirone's hand, trembling. Everything I've done is my fault, Shirone. I will never abandon you. With that, he pulled his little son into a warm embrace, fearing he might lose him. The tears of love from a father flowed like a river. Vincent wept and pleaded, please forgive this foolish father. You mean everything to me.